Chapter 1 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1. The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Translated by Arthur Machen. Episode 1. Childhood. Chapter 3. Bettina is supposed to go mad. Father Mancia, the smallpox. I leave Padua. Bettina must have been in despair, not knowing into whose hands her letter had fallen, to return it to her and thus to allay her anxiety was therefore a great proof of friendship. But my generosity, at the same time that it freed her from a keen sorrow, must have cost her another, quite as dreadful, for she knew that I was master of her secret. Cordiani's letter was perfectly explicit. It gave the strongest evidence that she was in the habit of receiving him every night, and therefore the story she had prepared to deceive me was useless. I felt it was so, and, being disposed to calm her anxiety as far as I could, I went to her bedside in the morning, and placed in her hands Cordiani's note and my answer to her letter. The girl's spirit and talent had won my esteem. I could no longer despise her. I saw in her only a poor creature seduced by her natural temperament. She loved man, and was to be pitied only on account of the consequences. Believing that the view I took of the situation was a right one, I had resigned myself like a reasonable being, and not like a disappointed lover. The shame was for her, and not for me. I had only one wish, namely, to find out whether the two brothers, Feltrini, Cordiani's companions, had likewise shared Bettina's favours. Bettina put on throughout the day a cheerful and happy look. In the evening she dressed herself for the ball, but suddenly an attack of sickness, whether feigned or real I did not know, compelled her to go to bed, and frightened everybody in the house. As for myself, knowing the whole affair, I was prepared for new scenes, and indeed for sad ones, for I felt that I had obtained over her a power repugnant to her vanity and self-love. I must however confess that, in spite of the excellent school in which I found myself before I had attained manhood, and which ought to have given me experience as a shield for the future, I have through the whole of my life been the dupe of women. 12 years ago, if it had not been for my guardian angel, I would have foolishly married a young, thoughtless girl with whom I had fallen in love. Now that I am 72 years old, I believe myself no longer susceptible to such follies. But alas, that is the very thing which causes me to be miserable. The next day the whole family was deeply grieved, because the devil of whom Bettina was possessed had made himself master of her reason. Dr. Gozzi told me that there could not be the shadow of a doubt that his unfortunate sister was possessed, as, if she had only been mad, she never would have so cruelly ill-treated the Capuchin, Prospero, and he determined to place her under the care of Father Mancia. This Mancia was a celebrated Jacobin, or Dominican, exorcist, who enjoyed the reputation of never having failed to cure a girl possessed of the demon. Sunday had come. Bettina had made a good dinner, but she had been frantic all through the day. Towards midnight her father came home, singing Tasso as usual, and so drunk that he could not stand. He went up to Bettina's bed, and after kissing her affectionately, he said to her, "Thou art not mad, my girl." Her answer was that he was not drunk. "Thou art possessed of the devil, my dear child." "Yes, father, and you alone can cure me." "Well, I am ready." Upon this, our shoemaker begins a theological discourse, expatiating upon the power of faith, and upon the virtue of the paternal blessing. He throws off his cloak, takes a crucifix in one hand, places the other over the head of his daughter, and addresses the devil in such an amusing way that even his wife, always a stupid, dull, cross-grained old woman, had to laugh till the tears came down her cheek. The two performers in the comedy alone were not laughing, and this serious countenance added to the fun of the performance. I marvelled at Bettina, who was always ready to enjoy a good laugh, having sufficient control over herself to remain calm and grave. Dr. Gozzi had also given way to merriment, but begged that the farce should come to an end, for he deemed that his father's eccentricities were as many profanations against the sacredness of exorcism. At last the exorcist, doubtless tired out, went to bed, saying that he was certain that the devil would not disturb his daughter during the night. On the morrow, just as we had finished our breakfast, Father Mancia made his appearance. Dr. Gozzi, followed by the whole family, escorted him to his sister's bedside. As for me, I was entirely taken up by the farce of the monk. Here is his portrait. His figure was tall and majestic, his age about 30. He had light hair and blue eyes. His features were close to those of Apollo, but without his pride and assuming haughtiness. His complexion, dazzling white, was pale, but that paleness seemed to have been given for the very purpose of showing off the red coral of his lips, through which could be seen, when they opened, 2 rows of pearls. He was neither thin nor stout, and the habitual sadness of his countenance enhanced its sweetness. His gait was slow, his air timid, an indication of the great modesty of his mind. When we entered the room, Bettina was asleep, or pretended to be so. Father Mancia took a sprinkler and threw over her a few drops of holy water. She opened her eyes, looked at the monk, and closed them immediately. A little while after she opened them again, had a better look at him, laid herself on her back, let her arms droop down gently, and with her head prettily bent on one side she fell into the sweetest of slumbers. The exorcist, standing by the bed, took out his pocket ritual, and the stole, which he put round his neck, then a reliquary, which he placed on the bosom of the sleeping girl, and with the air of a saint he begged all of us to fall on our knees and to pray, so that God should let him know whether the patient was possessed, or only laboring under a natural disease. He kept us kneeling for half an hour, reading all the time in a low tone of voice. Bettina did not stir. Tired, I suppose, of the performance, he desired to speak privately with Dr. Gozzi. They passed into the next room, out of which they emerged after a quarter of an hour, brought back by a loud peal of laughter from the mad girl, who, when she saw them, turned her back on them. Father Mancia smiled, dipped the sprinkler over and over in the holy water, gave us all a generous shower, and took his leave. Dr. Gozzi told us that the exorcist would come again on the morrow, and that he had promised to deliver Bettina within 3 hours if she were truly possessed of the demon, but that he made no promise if it should turn out to be a case of madness. The mother exclaimed that he would surely deliver her, and she poured out her thanks to God for having allowed her the grace of beholding a saint before her death. The following day Bettina was in a fine frenzy. She began to utter the most extravagant speeches that a poet could imagine, and did not stop when the charming exorcist came into her room. He seemed to enjoy her foolish talk for a few minutes, after which, having armed himself cap a pie, he begged us to withdraw. His order was obeyed instantly. We left the chamber, and the door remained open. But what did it matter? Who would have been bold enough to go in? During 3 long hours we heard nothing. The stillness was unbroken. At noon the monk called us in. Bettina was there sad and very quiet, while the exorcist packed up his things. He took his departure, saying he had very good hopes of the case, and requesting that the doctor would send him news of the patient. Bettina partook of dinner in her bed, got up for supper, and the next day behaved herself rationally. But the following circumstance strengthened my opinion that she had been neither insane nor possessed. It was 2 days before the purification of the Holy Virgin. Dr. Gozzi was in the habit of giving us the sacrament in his own church, but he always sent us for our confession to the church of St. Augustine, in which the Jacobins of Padua officiated. At the supper table he told us to prepare ourselves for the next day, and his mother, addressing us, said, "You ought, all of you, to confess to Father Mancia, so as to obtain absolution from that holy man. I intend to go to him myself." Cordiani and the 2 Feltrini agreed to the proposal. I remained silent, but as the idea was unpleasant to me, I concealed the feeling, with a full determination to prevent the execution of the project. I had entire confidence in the secrecy of confessions, and I was incapable of making a false one. But knowing that I had a right to choose my confessor, I most certainly never would have been so simple as to confess to Father Mancia what had taken place between me and the girl, because he would have easily guessed that the girl could be no other but Bettina. Besides, I was satisfied that Cordiani would confess everything to the monk, and I was deeply sorry. Early the next morning, Bettina brought me a band for my neck, and gave me the following letter: "Spurn me, but respect my honor and the shadow of peace to which I aspire. No one from this house must confess to Father Mancia. You alone can prevent the execution of that project, and I need not suggest the way to succeed. It will prove whether you have some friendship for me." I could not express the pity I felt for the poor girl, as I read that note. In spite of that feeling, this is what I answered: "I can well understand that, notwithstanding the inviolability of confession, your mother's proposal should cause you great anxiety, but I cannot see why, in order to prevent its execution, you should depend upon me rather than upon Cordiani, who has expressed his acceptance of it. All I can promise you is that I will not be one of those who may go to Father Mancia, but I have no influence over your lover. You alone can speak to him." She replied, "I have never addressed a word to Cordiani since the fatal night which has sealed my misery, and I never will speak to him again, even if I could by so doing recover my lost happiness. To you alone I wish to be indebted for my life and for my honor." The girl appeared to me more wonderful than all the heroines of whom I had read in novels. It seemed to me that she was making sport of me with the most barefaced effrontery. I thought she was trying to fetter me again with her chains, and although I had no inclination for them, I made up my mind to render her the service she claimed at my hands, and which she believed I alone could compass. She felt certain of her success, but in what school had she obtained her experience of human heart? Was it in reading novels? Most likely the reading of a certain class of novels causes the ruin of a great many young girls, but I am of opinion that from good romances they acquire graceful manners and a knowledge of society. Having made up my mind to show her every kindness in my power, I took an opportunity, as we were undressing for the night, of telling Dr. Gozzi that for conscientious motives I could not confess to Father Mancia, and yet that I did not wish to be an exception in that matter. He kindly answered that he understood my reasons, and that he would take us all to the church of Saint Antoine. I kissed his hand in token of my gratitude. On the following day, everything having gone according to her wishes, I saw Bettina sit down to the table with a face beaming with satisfaction. In the afternoon I had to go to bed in consequence of a wound in my foot. The doctor accompanied his pupils to church, and Bettina, being alone, availed herself of the opportunity, came to my room and sat down on my bed. I had expected her visit, and I received it with pleasure, as it heralded an explanation for which I was positively longing. She began by expressing a hope that I would not be angry with her for seizing the first opportunity she had of some conversation with me. "No," I answered, "for you thus afford me an occasion of assuring you that, my feelings toward you being those of a friend only, you need not have any fear of my causing you any anxiety or pleasure. Therefore, Bettina, you may do whatever suits you. My love is no more. You have, at one blow, given the death stroke to the intense passion which was blossoming in my heart. When I reached my room, after the ill treatment I had experienced at Cordiani's hands, I felt for you nothing but hatred. That feeling soon merged into utter contempt, but that sensation itself was in time, when my mind recovered its balance, changed for a feeling of the deepest indifference, which again has given way when I saw what power there is in your mind. I have now become your friend. I have conceived the greatest esteem for your cleverness. I have been the dupe of it, but no matter. That talent of yours does exist. It is wonderful, divine. I admire it, I love it, and the highest homage I can render to it is, in my estimation, to foster for the possessor of it the purest feelings of friendship. Reciprocate that friendship. Be true, sincere, and plain dealing. Give up all nonsense, for you have already obtained from me all I can give you. The very thought of love is repugnant to me. I can bestow my love only where I feel certain of being the only one loved. You are at liberty to lay my foolish delicacy to the account of my youthful age, but I feel so, and I cannot help it. You have written to me that you never speak to Cordiani. If I am the cause of that rupture between you, I regret it, and I think that, in the interest of your honor, you would do well to make it up with him. For the future, I must be careful never to give him any grounds for umbrage or suspicion. Recollect also, that, if you have tempted him by the same manoeuvres which you have employed towards me, you are doubly wrong, for it may be that, if he truly loves you, you have caused him to be miserable." "All you have just said to me," answered Bettina, "is grounded upon false impressions and deceptive appearances. I do not love Cordiani, and I never had any love for him. On the contrary, I have felt, and I do feel, for him a hatred which he has richly deserved, and I hope to convince you, in spite of every appearance which seems to convict me. As to the reproach of seduction, I entreat you to spare me such an accusation. On our side, consider that, if you had not yourself thrown temptation in my way, I never would have committed towards you an action of which I have deeply repented, for reasons which you do not know, but which you must learn from me. The fault I have been guilty of is a serious one, only because I did not foresee the injury it would do me in the inexperienced mind of the ingrate who dares to reproach me with it." Bettina was shedding tears. All she had said was not unlikely and rather complimentary to my vanity, but I had seen too much. Besides, I knew the extent of her cleverness, and it was very natural to lend her a wish to deceive me. How could I help thinking that her visit to me was prompted only by her self-love being too deeply wounded to let me enjoy a victory so humiliating to herself? Therefore, unshaken in my preconceived opinion, I told her that I placed implicit confidence in all she had just said respecting the state of her heart previous to the playful nonsense which had been the origin of my love for her, and that I promised never in the future to allude again to my accusation of seduction. "But," I continued, "confess that the fire at that time burning in your bosom was only of short duration, and that the slightest breath of wind had been enough to extinguish it. Your virtue, which went astray for only one instant, and which has so suddenly recovered its mastery over your senses, deserves some praise. You, with all your deep adoring love for me, became all at once blind to my sorrow, whatever care I took to make it clear to your sight. It remains for me to learn how that virtue could be so very dear to you, at the very time that Cordiani took care to wreck it every night." Bettina eyed me with the air of triumph which perfect confidence in victory gives to a person, and said, you have just reached the point where I wished you to be. You shall not be made aware of things which I could not explain before, owing to your refusing the appointment which I then gave you for no other purpose than to tell you all the truth. Cordiani declared his love for me a week after he became an inmate in our house. He begged my consent to a marriage, if his father made the demand of my hand as soon as he could have completed his studies. My answer was that I did not know him sufficiently, that I could form no idea on the subject, and I requested him not to allude to it any more. He appeared to have quietly given up the matter, but soon after I found out that it was not the case. He begged me one day to come to his room now and then to dress his hair. I told him I had no time to spare, and he remarked that you were more fortunate. I laughed at this reproach, as everyone here knew that I had the care of you. It was a fortnight after my refusal to Cordiani that I unfortunately spent an hour with you in that loving nonsense which has naturally given you ideas, until then unknown to your senses. That hour made me very happy. I loved you, and having given way to every natural desires, I revelled in my enjoyment without the slightest remorse of conscience. I was longing to be again with you the next morning, but after supper misfortune laid for the first time its hands upon me. Cordiani slipped in my hands this note and this letter, which I have since hidden in a hole in the wall, with the intention of showing them to you at the first opportunity. Seeing this, Bettina handed me the note and the letter. The first ran as follows: "Admit me this evening in your closet, the door of which, leading to the yard, can be left ajar, or prepare yourself to make the best of it with the doctor, to whom I intend to deliver, if you should refuse my request, the letter of which I enclose a copy." End of Part 1 of Episode 1, Chapter 3.
Chapter 3, Part 2 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Translated by Arthur Machen. Episode 1, Childhood. Chapter 3, Part 2. The letter contained the statement of a cowardly and enraged informer, and would certainly have caused the most unpleasant results. In that letter Cordiani informed the doctor that his sister spent her mornings with me in criminal connection while he was saying his mass, and he pledged himself to enter into particulars which would leave him no doubt. "After giving to the case the consideration it required," continued Bettina, "I made up my mind to hear that monster. But my determination being fixed, I put in my pocket my father's stiletto, and holding my door ajar, I waited for him there, unwilling to let him come in, as my closet is divided only by a thin partition from the room of my father, whom the slightest noise might have roused up. My first question to Cordiani was in reference to the slander contained in the letter he threatened to deliver to my brother. He answered that it was no slander, for he had been a witness to everything that had taken place in the morning through a hole he had bored in the garret just above your bed, and to which he would apply his eye the moment he knew that I was in your room. He wound up by threatening to discover everything to my brother and to my mother, unless I granted him the same favours I had bestowed upon you. In my just indignation I loaded him with the most bitter insults. I called him a cowardly spy and slanderer, for he could not have seen anything but childish playfulness, and I declared to him that he need not flatter himself that any threat would compel me to give the slightest compliance to his wishes. He then begged and begged my pardon 1,000 times, and went on assuring me that I must lay to my rigour the odium of the step he had taken, the only excuse for it being in the fervent love I had kindled in his heart, and which made him miserable. He acknowledged that his letter might be a slander, that he had acted treacherously, and he pledged his honour never to attempt obtaining from me by violence favours which he desired to merit only by the constancy of his love. I then thought myself to some extent compelled to say that I might love him at some future time, and to promise that I would not again come near your bed during the absence of my brother. In this way I dismissed him satisfied, without his daring to beg for so much as a kiss, but with the promise that we might now and then have some conversation in the same place. As soon as he left me I went to bed, deeply grieved that I could no longer see you in the absence of my brother, and that I was unable, for fear of consequences, to let you know the reason of my change. 3 weeks passed off in that position, and I cannot express what have been my sufferings, for you, of course, urged me to come, and I was always under the painful necessity of disappointing you. I even feared to find myself alone with you, for I felt certain that I could not have refrained from telling you the cause of the change in my conduct. To crown my misery, add that I found myself compelled, at least once a week, to receive the vile Cordiani outside of my room and to speak to him in order to check his impatience with a few words. At last, unable to bear up any longer under such misery, threatened likewise by you, I determined to end my agony. I wished to disclose to you all this intrigue, leaving to you the care of bringing a change for the better, and for that purpose I proposed that you should accompany me to the ball disguised as a girl, although I knew it would enrage Cordiani. But my mind was made up. You know how my scheme fell to the ground. The unexpected departure of my brother with my father suggested to both of you the same idea, and it was before receiving Cordiani's letter that I promised to come to you. Cordiani did not ask for an appointment. He only stated that he would be waiting for me in my closet, and I had no opportunity of telling him that I could not allow him to come, any more than I could find time to let you know that I would be with you only after midnight, as I intended to do, for I reckoned that after an hour's talk I would dismiss the wretch to his room. But my reckoning was wrong. Cordiani had conceived a scheme, and I could not help listening to all he had to say about it. His whining and exaggerated complaints had no end. He upbraided me for refusing to further the plan he had concocted, and which he thought I would accept with rapture if I loved him. The scheme was for me to elope with him during Holy Week, and to run away to Ferrara, where he had an uncle who would have given us a kind welcome, and would soon have brought his father to forgive him and to ensure our happiness for life. The objections I made, his answers, the details to be entered into, the explanations and the ways and means to be examined to obviate the difficulties of the project, took up the whole night. My heart was bleeding as I thought of you, but my conscience is at rest, and I did nothing that could render me unworthy of your esteem. You cannot refuse it to me, unless you believe that the confession I have just made is untrue, but you would be both mistaken and unjust. Had I made up my mind to sacrifice myself and to grant favours which love alone ought to obtain, I might have got rid of the treacherous wretch within 1 hour, but death seemed preferable to such a dreadful expedient. Could I in any way suppose that you were outside of my door, exposed to the wind and to the snow? Both of us were deserving of pity, but my misery was still greater than yours. All these fearful circumstances were written in the book of fate, to make me lose my reason, which now returns only at intervals, and I am in constant dread of a fresh attack of those awful convulsions. They say I am bewitched, and possessed of the demon. I do not know anything about it, but if it should be true, I am the most miserable creature in existence." Bettina ceased speaking, and burst into a violent storm of tears, sobs, and groans. I was deeply moved, although I felt that all she had said might be true, and yet was scarcely worthy of belief. Forse era ver, ma non pero credibile, acci del senso sua fosse signor. But she was weeping, and her tears, which at all events were not deceptive, took away from me the faculty of doubt. Yet I put her tears to the account of her wounded self-love. To give way entirely, I needed a thorough conviction, and to obtain it evidence was necessary, probability was not enough. I could not admit either Cordiani's moderation or Bettina's patience, or the fact of 7 hours employed in innocent conversation. In spite of all these considerations, I felt a sort of pleasure in accepting for ready cash all the counterfeit coins that she had spread out before me. After drying her tears, Bettina fixed her beautiful eyes upon mine, thinking that she could discern in them evident signs of a victory. But I surprised her much by alluding to one point which, with all her cunning, she had neglected to mention in her defence. Rhetoric makes use of nature's secrets in the same way as painters who try to imitate it. Their most beautiful work is false. This young girl, whose mind had not been refined by study, aimed at being considered innocent and artless, and she did her best to succeed, but I had seen too good a specimen of her cleverness. "Well, my dear Bettina," I said, Your story has affected me, but how do you think I am going to accept your convulsions as natural, and to believe in the demoniac symptoms which came on so seasonably during the exorcisms, although you very properly expressed your doubts on the matter?" Hearing this, Bettina stared at me, remaining silent for a few minutes. Then, casting her eyes down, she gave way to fresh tears, exclaiming now and then, "Poor me! Oh, poor me!" This situation, however, becoming most painful to me, I asked what I could do for her. She answered in a sad tone that if my heart did not suggest to me what to do, she did not herself see what she could demand of me. "I thought," said she, "that I would reconquer my lost influence over your heart, but I see it too plainly, you no longer feel an interest in me. Go on treating me harshly, go on taking for mere fictions sufferings which are but too real, which you have caused, and which you will now increase. Some day, but too late, you will be sorry, and your repentance will be bitter indeed." As she pronounced these words, she rose to take her leave, but, judging her capable of anything, I felt afraid, and I detained her to say that the only way to regain my affection was to remain 1 month without convulsions and without handsome Father Mancia's presence being required. "I cannot help being convulsed," she answered, "but what do you mean by applying to the Jacobin that epithet of handsome? Could you suppose—" "Not at all, not at all. I suppose nothing. To do so, it would be necessary for me to be jealous. But I cannot help saying that the preference given by your devils to the exorcism of that handsome monk over the incantations of the ugly Capuchin is likely to give birth to remarks rather detrimental to your honour. Moreover, you are free to do whatever pleases you." Thereupon she left my room, and a few minutes later everybody came home. After supper the servant, without any question on my part, informed me that Bettina had gone to bed with violent feverish chills, having previously had her bed carried into the kitchen beside her mother's. This attack of fever might be real, but I had my doubts. I felt certain that she would never make up her mind to be well, for her good health would have supplied me with too strong an argument against her pretended innocence, even in the case of Cordiani. I likewise considered her idea of having her bed placed near her mother's nothing but artful contrivance. The next day Dr. Olivo found her very feverish, and told her brother that she would most likely be excited and delirious, but that it would be the effect of the fever, and not the work of the devil. And truly, Bettina was raving all day, but Dr. Gozzi, placing implicit confidence in the physician, would not listen to his mother, and did not send for the Jacobin friar. The fever increased in violence, and on the 4th day the smallpox broke out. Cordiani and the 2 brothers Vetrini, who had so far escaped that disease, were immediately sent away, but as I had had it before, I remained at home. The poor girl was so fearfully covered with the loathsome eruption that on the 6th day her skin could not be seen on any part of her body. Her eyes closed, and her life was despaired of when it was found that her mouth and throat were obstructed to such a degree that she could swallow nothing but a few drops of honey. She was perfectly motionless, she breathed, and that was all. Her mother never left her bedside, and I was thought a saint when I carried my table and my books into the patient's room. The unfortunate girl had become a fearful sight to look upon. Her head was dreadfully swollen, the nose could no longer be seen, and much fear was entertained for her eyes, in case her life should be spared. The odour of her perspiration was most offensive, but I persisted in keeping my watch by her. On the 9th day the vicar gave her absolution, and after administering extreme unction he left her, as he said, in the hands of God. In the midst of so much sadness, the conversation of the mother with her son would, in spite of myself, cause me some amount of merriment. The good woman wanted to know whether the demon who was dwelling in her child could still influence her to perform extravagant follies, and what would become of the demon in the case of her daughter's death, for, as she expressed it, she could not think of his being so stupid as to remain in so loathsome a body. She particularly wanted to ascertain whether the demon had power to carry off the soul of her child. Dr. Gozzi, who was a ubiquitarian, made to all those questions answers which had not even the shadow of good sense, and which of course had no other effect than to increase 100-fold the perplexity of his poor mother. During the 10th and 11th days, Bettina was so bad that we thought every moment likely to be her last. The disease had reached its worst period. The smell was unbearable. I alone would not leave her, so sorely did I pity her. The heart of man is indeed an unfathomable abyss, for, however incredible it may appear, it was while in that fearful state that Bettina inspired me with the fondness which I showed her after her recovery. On the 13th day the fever abated, but the patient began to experience great irritation owing to a dreadful itching, which no remedy could have allayed as effectually as these powerful words which I kept constantly pouring into her ear. "Bettina, you are getting better, but if you dare to scratch yourself, you will become such a fright that nobody will ever love you." All the physicians in the universe might be challenged to prescribe a more potent remedy against itching for a girl who, aware that she has been pretty, finds herself exposed to the loss of her beauty through her own fault if she scratches herself. At last her fine eyes opened again to the light of heaven. She was moved to her own room, but she had to keep her bed until Easter. She inoculated me with a few pox, 3 of which have left upon my face everlasting marks, but in her eyes they gave me credit for great devotedness, for they were a proof of my constant care, and she felt that I indeed deserved her whole love. And she truly loved me, and I returned her love, although I never plucked a flower which fate and prejudice kept in store for a husband. But what a contemptible husband! 2 years later she married a shoemaker by name Pigozzo, a base, arrant knave, who beggared and ill-treated her to such an extent that her brother had to take her home and to provide for her. 15 years afterwards, having been appointed archpriest at Saint Georges de la Vallée, he took her there with him, and when I went to pay him a visit 18 years ago, I found Bettina old, ill, and dying. She breathed her last in my arms in 1776, 24 hours after my arrival. I will speak of her death in good time. About that period my mother returned from St. Petersburg, where the Empress Anne Ivanovna had not approved of the Italian comedy. The whole of the troupe had already returned to Italy, and my mother had travelled with Carlin Bertinazzi, the Harlequin, who died in Paris in the year 1783. As soon as she had reached Padua, she informed Dr. Gozzi of her arrival, and he lost no time in accompanying me to the inn where she had put up. We dined with her, and before bidding us adieu, she presented the doctor with a splendid fur, and gave me the skin of a lynx for Bettina. 6 months afterwards she summoned me to Venice, as she wished to see me before leaving for Dresden, where she had contracted an engagement for life in the service of the Elector of Saxony, Augustus III, King of Poland. She took with her my brother Jean, then 8 years old, who was weeping bitterly when he left. I thought him very foolish, for there was nothing very tragic in that departure. He is the only one in the family who was wholly indebted to our mother for his fortune, although he was not her favourite child. I spent another year in Padua, studying law, in which I took the degree of doctor in my 16th year, the subject of my thesis being in the civil law, the testamentis, and in the canon law, Utrum Hebraei possunt construere novas synagogas. My vocation was to study medicine, and to practice it, for I felt a great inclination for that profession. But no heed was given to my wishes, and I was compelled to apply myself to the study of the law, for which I had an invincible repugnance. My friends were of opinion that I could not make my fortune in any profession but that of an advocate, and, what is still worse, of an ecclesiastical advocate. If they had given the matter proper consideration, they would have given me leave to follow my own inclinations, and I would have been a physician, a profession in which quackery is of still greater avail than in the legal business. I never became either a physician or an advocate, and I never would apply to a lawyer when I had any legal business, nor call in a physician when I happened to be ill. Lawsuits and pettifoggery may support a good many families, but a greater proportion is ruined by them, and those who perish in the hands of physicians are more numerous by far than those who get cured. Strong evidence, in my opinion, that mankind would be much less miserable without either lawyers or doctors. To attend the lectures of the professors, I had to go to the university called the Beau, and it became necessary for me to go out alone. This was a matter of great wonder to me, for until then I had never considered myself a free man, and in my wish to enjoy fully the liberty I thought I had just conquered, it was not long before I had made the very worst acquaintances amongst the most renowned students. As a matter of course, the most renowned were the most worthless, dissolute fellows, gamblers, frequenters of disorderly houses, hard drinkers, debauchees, tormentors and suborners of honest girls, liars, and wholly incapable of any good or virtuous feeling. In the company of such men did I begin my apprenticeship of the world, learning my lesson from the book of experience. The theory of morals and its usefulness through the life of man can be compared to the advantage derived by running over the index of a book before reading it. When we have perused that index, we know nothing but the subject of the work. This is like the school for morals offered by the sermons, the precepts, and the tales which our instructors recite for our especial benefit. We lend our whole attention to those lessons, but when an opportunity offers of profiting by the advice thus bestowed upon us, we feel inclined to ascertain for ourselves whether the result will turn out as predicted. We give way to that very natural inclination, and punishment speedily follows with concomitant repentance. Our only consolation lies in the fact that in such moments we are conscious of our own knowledge, and consider ourselves as having earned the right to instruct others. But those to whom we wish to impart our experience act exactly as we have acted before them, and, as a matter of course, the world remains in statu quo, or grows worse and worse. When Dr. Gozzi granted me the privilege of going out alone, he gave me an opportunity for the discovery of several truths which, until then, were not only unknown to me, but the very existence of which I had never suspected. On my first appearance, the boldest scholars got hold of me and sounded my depth. Finding that I was a thorough freshman, they undertook my education, and with that worthy purpose in view they allowed me to fall blindly into every trap. They taught me gambling, won the little I possessed, and then they made me play upon trust, and put me up to dishonest practices in order to procure the means of paying my gambling debts, but I acquired at the same time the sad experience of sorrow. Yet these hard lessons proved useful, for they taught me to mistrust the impudent sycophants who openly flatter their dupes, and never to rely upon the offers made by fawning flatterers. They taught me likewise how to behave in the company of quarrelsome duellists, the society of whom ought to be avoided, unless we make up our minds to be constantly in the very teeth of danger. I was not caught in the snares of professional lewd women, because not one of them was in my eyes as pretty as Bettina, but I did not resist so well the desire for that species of vainglory which is the reward of holding life at a cheap price. In those days the students in Padua enjoyed very great privileges, which were in reality abuses made legal through prescription, the primitive characteristic of privileges, which differ essentially from prerogatives. In fact, in order to maintain the legality of their privileges, the students often committed crimes. The guilty were dealt with tenderly, because the interest of the city demanded that severity should not diminish the great influx of scholars who flocked to that renowned university from every part of Europe. The practice of the Venetian government was to secure at a high salary the most celebrated professors, and to grant the utmost freedom to the young men attending their lessons. The students acknowledged no authority but that of a chief chosen among themselves, and called syndic. He was usually a foreign nobleman, who could keep a large establishment, and who was responsible to the government for the behaviour of the scholars. It was his duty to give them up to justice when they transgressed the laws, and the students never disputed his sentence, because he always defended them to the utmost when they had the slightest shadow of right on their side. The students, amongst other privileges, would not suffer their trunks to be searched by custom-house authorities, and no ordinary policeman would have dared to arrest one of them. They carried about them forbidden weapons, seduced helpless girls, and often disturbed the public peace by their nocturnal broils and impudent practical jokes. In one word, they were a body of young fellows whom nothing could restrain, who would gratify every whim, and enjoy their sport without regard or consideration for any human being. It was about that time that a policeman entered a coffee-room in which were seated two students. One of them ordered him out, but the man taking no notice of it, the student fired a pistol at him, and missed his aim. The policeman returned the fire, wounded the aggressor, and ran away. The students immediately mustered together at the bow, divided into bands, and went over the city, hunting the policemen to murder them, and avenge the insult they had received. In one of the encounters 2 of the students were killed, and all the others, assembling in one troop, swore never to lay their arms down as long as there should be one policeman alive in Padua. The authorities had to interfere, and the syndic of the students undertook to put a stop to hostilities, provided proper satisfaction was given, as the police were in the wrong. The man who had shot the student in the coffee-room was hanged, and peace was restored. But during the 8 days of agitation, as I was anxious not to appear less brave than my comrades who were patrolling the city, I followed them, in spite of Dr. Gozzi's remonstrances. Armed with a carbine and a pair of pistols, I ran about the town with the others in quest of the enemy, and I recollect how disappointed I was because the troop to which I belonged did not meet one policeman. When the war was over, the doctor laughed at me, but Bettina admired my valour. Unfortunately, I indulged in expenses far above my means, owing to my unwillingness to seem poorer than my new friends. I sold or pledged everything I possessed, and I contracted debts which I could not possibly pay. This state of things caused my first sorrows, and they are the most poignant sorrows under which a young man can smart. Not knowing which way to turn, I wrote to my excellent grandmother, begging her assistance, but instead of sending me some money, she came to Padua on the 1st of October 1739, and, after thanking the doctor and Bettina for all their affectionate care, she brought me back to Venice. As he took leave of me, the doctor, who was shedding tears, gave me what he prized most on earth, a relic of some saint, which perhaps I might have kept to this very day, had not the setting been of gold. It performed only one miracle, that of being of service to me in a moment of great need. Whenever I visited Padua to complete my study of the law, I stayed at the house of the kind doctor, but I was always grieved at seeing near Bettina the brute to whom she was engaged, and who did not appear to me deserving of such a wife. I have always regretted that a prejudice, of which I soon got rid, should have made me preserve for that man a flower which I could have plucked so easily. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4, Part A of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Chapter 4, Part A. Chapter 4. I receive the minor orders from the Patriarch of Venice. I get acquainted with Senator Malipiero, with Therese Eimer, with the niece of the curate, with Madame Orio, with Nanette and Martin, and with the Calamacchia. I become a preacher, my adventure with Lucie at Pasean, a rendezvous on the third story. He comes from Padua, where he has completed his studies. Such were the words by which I was everywhere introduced, and which, the moment they were uttered, called upon me the silent observation of every young man of my age and condition, the compliments of all fathers, and the caresses of old women, as well as the kisses of a few who, although not old, were not sorry to be considered so for the sake of embracing a young man without impropriety. The curate of Saint Samuel, the Abbé Giosello, presented me to Monsignor Correre, Patriarch of Venice, who gave me the tonsure, and who, 4 months afterwards, by special favour, admitted me to the 4 minor orders. No words could express the joy and the pride of my grandmother. Excellent masters were given to me to continue my studies, and M. Buffo chose the Abbé Schiavo to teach me a pure Italian style, especially poetry, for which I had a decided talent. I was very comfortably lodged with my brother Francois, who was studying theatrical architecture. My sister and my youngest brother were living with our grande dame in a house of her own, in which it was her wish to die, because her husband had there breathed his last. The house in which I dwelt was the same in which my father had died, and the rent of which my mother continued to pay. It was large and well furnished. Although Abbé Grimani was my chief protector, I seldom saw him, and I particularly attached myself to M. de Malipiero, to whom I had been presented by the curate Giuseppe. M. de Malipiero was a senator, who was unwilling at 70 years of age to attend any more to state affairs, and enjoyed a happy, sumptuous life in his mansion, surrounded every evening by a well-chosen party of ladies who had all known how to make the best of their younger days, and of gentlemen who were always acquainted with the news of the town. He was a bachelor and wealthy, but, unfortunately, he had 3 or 4 times every year severe attacks of gout, which always left him crippled in some part or other of his body, so that all his person was disabled. His head, his lungs, and his stomach had alone escaped this cruel habit. He was still a fine man, a great epicure, and a good judge of wine. His wit was keen, his knowledge of the world extensive, his eloquence worthy of a son of Venice, and he had that wisdom which must naturally belong to a senator who for 14 years had had the management of public affairs, and to a man who has bid farewell to women after having possessed 20 mistresses, and only when he felt himself compelled to acknowledge that he could no longer be accepted by any woman. Although almost entirely crippled, he did not appear to be so when he was seated, when he talked, or when he was at the table. He had only 1 meal a day, and always took it alone because, being toothless and unable to eat otherwise than very slowly, he did not wish to hurry himself out of compliment to his guests, and would have been sorry to see them waiting for him. This feeling deprived him of the pleasure he would have enjoyed in entertaining at his board friendly and agreeable guests, and caused great sorrow to his excellent cook. The first time I had the honour of being introduced to him by a curate, I opposed earnestly the reason which made him eat his meals in solitude, and I said that His Excellency had only to invite guests whose appetite was good enough to enable them to eat a double share. "But where can I find such table companions?" he asked. "It is rather a delicate matter," I answered, "but you must take your guests on trial, and after they have been found such as you wish them to be, the only difficulty will be to keep them as your guests without their being aware of the real cause of your preference, for no respectable man could acknowledge that he enjoys the honour of sitting at your Excellency's table only because he eats twice as much as any other man." The senator understood the truth of my argument, and asked the curate to bring me to dinner on the following day. He found my practice even better than my theory, and I became his daily guest. This man, who had given up everything in life except his own self, fostered an amorous inclination in spite of his age and of his gout. He loved a young girl named Thérèse Imer, the daughter of an actor residing near his mansion, her bedroom window being opposite to his own. This young girl, then in her 17th year, was pretty, whimsical, and a regular coquette. She was practising music with a view to entering the theatrical profession, and by showing herself constantly at the window she had intoxicated the old senator, and was playing with him cruelly. She paid him a daily visit, but always escorted by her mother, a former actress, who had retired from the stage in order to work out her salvation, and who, as a matter of course, had made up her mind to combine the interests of heaven with the works of this world. She took her daughter to mass every day, and compelled her to go to confession every week, but every afternoon she accompanied her in a visit to the amorous old man, the rage of whom frightened me when she refused them a kiss under the plea that she had performed her devotions in the morning, and that she could not reconcile herself to the idea of offending the God who was still dwelling in her. What a sight for a young man of 15 like me, whom the old man admitted as the only and silent witness of these erotic scenes! The miserable mother applauded her daughter's reserve, and went so far as to lecture the elderly lover, who, in his turn, dared not refute her maxims, which savoured either too much or too little of Christianity, and resisted a very strong inclination to hurl at her head any object he had in hand. Anger would then take the place of lewd desires, and after they had retired he would comfort himself by exchanging with me philosophical considerations. Compelled to answer him, and not knowing well what to say, I ventured one day upon advising a marriage. He struck me with amazement when he answered that she refused to marry him from fear of drawing upon herself the hatred of his relatives. Then make her the offer of a large sum of money or a position. She says that she would not, even for a crown, commit a deadly sin. In that case you must either take her by storm or banish her forever from your presence. I can do neither one nor the other. Physical as well as moral strength is deficient in me. Kill her then. That will very likely be the case unless I die first. Indeed, I pity your Excellency. Do you sometimes visit her? No, for I might fall in love with her and I would be miserable. You are right. Witnessing many such scenes and taking part in many similar conversations, I became an especial favorite with the old nobleman. I was invited to his evening assemblies, which were, as I have stated before, frequented by superannuated women and witty men. He told me that in this circle I would learn a science of greater import than Gassendi's philosophy, which I was then studying by his advice instead of Aristotle's, which he turned into ridicule. He laid down some precepts for my conduct in these assemblies, explaining the necessity of my observing them, as there would be some wonder at a young man of my age being received at such parties. He ordered me never to open my lips except to answer direct questions, and particularly enjoined me never to pass an opinion on any subject, because at my age I could not be allowed to have any opinions. I faithfully followed his precepts and obeyed his orders so well that in a few days I had gained his esteem and become the child of the house, as well as the favourite of all the ladies who visited him. In my character of a young and innocent ecclesiastic, they would ask me to accompany them in their visits to the convents where their daughters or their nieces were educated. I was at all hours received at their houses without even being announced. I was scolded if a week elapsed without my calling upon them, and when I went to the apartments reserved for the young ladies, they would run away, but the moment they saw that the intruder was only I, they would return at once, and their confidence was very charming to me. Before dinner, M. de Malipiero would often inquire from me what advantages were accruing to me from the welcome I received at the hands of the respectable ladies I had become acquainted with at his house, taking care to tell me, before I could have time to answer, that they were all endowed with the greatest virtue, and that I would give everybody a bad opinion of myself if I ever breathed one word of disparagement to the high reputation they all enjoyed. In this way he would inculcate in me the wise precept of reserve and discretion. It was at the senator's house that I made the acquaintance of Madame Manzoni, the wife of a notary public, of whom I shall have to speak very often. This worthy lady inspired me with the deepest attachment, and she gave me the wisest advice. Had I followed it and profited by it, my life would not have been exposed to so many storms. It is true that in that case my life would not be worth writing. All these fine acquaintances amongst women who enjoyed the reputation of being high-bred ladies gave me a very natural desire to shine by my good looks and by the elegance of my dress. But my father confessor, as well as my grandmother, objected very strongly to this feeling of vanity. On one occasion, taking me apart, the curate told me, with honeyed words, that in the profession to which I had devoted myself, my thoughts ought to dwell upon the best means of being agreeable to God, and not on pleasing the world by my fine appearance. He condemned my elaborate curls and the exquisite perfume of my pomatum. He said that the devil had got hold of me by the hair, that I would be excommunicated if I continued to take such care of it, and concluded by quoting for my benefit these words from an ecumenical council: Clericus qui nutrit coman anathema sit. I answered him with the names of several fashionable perfumed abbots who were not threatened with excommunication, who were not interfered with, although they wore 4 times as much powder as I did, for I only used a slight sprinkling, who perfumed their hair with a certain amber-scented pomatum which brought women to the very point of fainting, while mine, a jessamine pomade, called forth the compliment of every circle in which I was received. I added that I could not, much to my regret, obey him, and that if I had meant to live in slovenliness, I would have become a Capuchin and not an abbé. My answer made him so angry that, 3 or 4 days afterwards, he contrived to obtain leave from my grandmother to enter my chamber early in the morning before I was awake, and, approaching my bed on tiptoe with a sharp pair of scissors, he cut off unmercifully all my front hair from one ear to the other. My brother Francois was in the adjoining room and saw him, but he did not interfere, as he was delighted at my misfortune. He wore a wig and was very jealous of my beautiful head of hair. Francois was envious through the whole of his life, yet he combined this feeling of envy with friendship. I never could understand it, but this vice of his, like my own vices, must by this time have died of old age. After his great operation, the abbé left my room quietly, but when I woke up shortly afterwards and realized all the horror of this unheard-of execution, my rage and indignation were indeed wrought to the highest pitch. What wild schemes of revenge my brain engendered while, with a looking-glass in my hand, I was groaning over the shameful havoc performed by this audacious priest. At the noise I made, my grandmother hastened to my room, and amidst my brother's laughter the kind old woman assured me that the priest would never have been allowed to enter my room if she could have foreseen his intention, and she managed to soothe my passion to some extent by confessing that he had overstepped the limits of his right to administer a reproof. But I was determined upon revenge, and I went on dressing myself and revolving in my mind the darkest plots. It seemed to me that I was entitled to the most cruel revenge, without having anything to dread from the terrors of the law. The theatres being open at that time, I put on a mask to go out, and I went to the advocate Carrare, with whom I had become acquainted at the senator's house, to inquire from him whether I could bring a suit against the priest. He told me that, but a short time since, a family had been ruined for having sheared the moustache of a Sclavonian, a crime not nearly so atrocious as the shearing of all my front locks, and that I had only to give him my instructions to begin a criminal suit against the abbé, which would make him tremble. I gave my consent, and begged that he would tell M. de Malipiero in the evening the reason for which I could not go to his house, for I did not feel any inclination to show myself anywhere until my hair had grown again. I went home and partook with my brother of a repast which appeared rather scanty in comparison to the dinners I had with the old senator. The privation of the delicate and plentiful fare to which his Excellency had accustomed me was most painful, besides all the enjoyments from which I was excluded through the atrocious conduct of the virulent priest who was my godfather. I wept from sheer vexation, and my rage was increased by the consciousness that there was in this insult a certain dash of comical fun, which threw over me a ridicule more disgraceful in my estimation than the greatest crime. I went to bed early, and, refreshed by 10 hours of profound slumber, I felt in the morning somewhat less angry, but quite as determined to summon the priest before a court. I dressed myself with the intention of calling upon my advocate, when I received the visit of a skilful hairdresser whom I had seen at Madame Cantarini's house. He told me that he was sent by M. de Malipiero to arrange my hair so that I could go out, as the senator wished me to dine with him on that very day. He examined the damage done to my head, and said, with a smile, that if I would trust to his art, he would undertake to send me out with an appearance of even greater elegance than I could boast of before. And truly, when he had done, I found myself so good-looking that I considered my thirst for revenge entirely satisfied. Having thus forgotten the injury, I called upon the lawyer to tell him to stay all proceedings, and I hastened to M. de Malipiero's palace, where, as chance would have it, I met the abbé. Notwithstanding all my joy, I could not help casting upon him rather unfriendly looks, but not a word was said about what had taken place. The senator noticed everything, and the priest took his leave, most likely with feelings of mortified repentance, for this time I most verily deserved excommunication by the extreme studied elegance of my curling hair. When my cruel godfather had left us, I did not dissemble with M. de Malipiero. I candidly told him that I would look out for another church, and that nothing would induce me to remain under a priest who, in his wrath, could go the length of such proceedings. The wise old man agreed with me, and said that I was quite right. It was the best way to make me do ultimately whatever he liked. In the evening, everyone in our circle, being well aware of what had happened, complimented me and assured me that nothing could be handsomer than my new headdress. I was delighted, and was still more gratified when, after a fortnight had lapsed, I found that M. de Malipiero did not broach the subject of my returning to my godfather's church. My grandmother alone constantly urged me to return, but this calm was the harbinger of a storm. When my mind was thoroughly at rest on that subject, M. de Malipiero threw me into the greatest astonishment by suddenly telling me that an excellent opportunity offered itself for me to reappear in the church and to secure ample satisfaction from the abbé. "It is my province," added the senator, as president of the Confraternity of the Holy Sacrament, "to choose the preacher who is to deliver the sermon on the 4th Sunday of this month, which happens to be the second Christmas holiday. I mean to appoint you, and I am certain that the abbé will not dare to reject my choice. What say you to such a triumphant reappearance? Does it satisfy you?" This offer caused me the greatest surprise, for I had never dreamt of becoming a preacher, and I had never been vain enough to suppose that I could write a sermon and deliver it in the church. I told M. de Malipiero that he must surely be enjoying a joke at my expense, but he answered that he had spoken in earnest, and he soon contrived to persuade me, and to make me believe that I was born to become the most renowned preacher of our age, as soon as I should have grown fat, a quality which I certainly could not boast of, for at that time I was extremely thin. I had not the shadow of a fear as to my voice or to my elocution, and for the matter of composing my sermon, I felt myself equal to the production of a masterpiece. I told M. de Malipiero that I was ready, and anxious to be at home in order to go to work, that, although no theologian, I was acquainted with my subject, and would compose a sermon which would take everyone by surprise, on account of its novelty. On the following day, when I called upon him, he informed me that the abbé had expressed unqualified delight at the choice made by him, and at my readiness in accepting the appointment, but he likewise desired that I should submit my sermon to him as soon as it was written, because, the subject belonging to the most sublime theology, he could not allow me to enter the pulpit without being satisfied that I would not utter any heresies. I agreed to this demand, and during the week I gave birth to my masterpiece. I have now that first sermon in my possession, and I cannot help saying that, considering my tender years, I think it a very good one. I could not give an idea of my grandmother's joy. She wept tears of happiness at having a grandson who had become an apostle. She insisted upon my reading my sermon to her, listened to it with her beads in her hands, and pronounced it very beautiful. M. de Malipiero, who had no rosary when I read it to him, was of opinion that it would not prove acceptable to the parson. My text was from Horace: Plorabere suis non respondere favorem spertum meritis, and I deplored the wickedness and ingratitude of men, through which had failed the design adopted by divine wisdom from the redemption of humankind. But M. de Malipiero was sorry that I had taken my text from any heretical poet, although he was pleased that my sermon was not interlarded with Latin quotations. I called upon the priest to read my production, but as he was out I had to wait for his return, and during that time I fell in love with his niece Angela. She was busy upon some tambour work. I sat down close by her, and telling me that she had long desired to make my acquaintance, she begged me to relate the history of the locks of hair sheared by her venerable uncle. My love for Angela proved fatal to me, because from it sprang two other love affairs which, in their turn, gave birth to a great many others, and caused me finally to renounce the church as a profession. But let us proceed quietly and not encroach upon future events. On his return home the abbé found me with his niece, who was about my age, and he did not appear to be angry. I gave him my sermon. He read it over and told me that it was a beautiful academical dissertation, but unfit for a sermon from the pulpit, and he added, "I will give you a sermon written by myself, which I have never delivered. You will commit it to memory, and I promise to let everybody suppose that it is of your own composition. I thank you, very reverend Father, but I will preach my own sermon, or none at all. At all events, you shall not preach such a sermon as this in my church. You can talk the matter over with M. de Malipiero. In the meantime, I will take my work to the censorship and to his eminence the Patriarch, and if it is not accepted, I shall have it printed." "All very well, young man. The Patriarch will coincide with me." In the evening I related my discussion with the parson before all the guests of M. de Malipiero. The reading of my sermon was called for, and it was praised by all. They lauded me for having with proper modesty refrained from quoting the holy fathers of the Church, whom at my age I could not be supposed to have sufficiently studied, and the ladies particularly admired me because there was no Latin in it but the text from Horace, who, although a great libertine himself, has written very good things. A niece of the Patriarch, who was present that evening, promised to prepare her uncle in my favour, as I had expressed my intention to appeal to him, but M. de Malipiero desired me not to take any steps in the matter until I had seen him on the following day, and I submissively bowed to his wishes. When I called at his mansion the next day, he sent for the priest, who soon made his appearance. As he knew well what he had been sent for, he immediately launched out into a very long discourse, which I did not interrupt, but the moment he had concluded his list of objections, I told him that there could not be two ways to decide the question, that the Patriarch would either approve or disapprove my sermon. "In the first case," I added, "I can pronounce it in your church, and no responsibility can possibly fall upon your shoulders. In the second, I must, of course, give way." The abbé was struck by my determination, and he said, "Do not go to the Patriarch. I accept your sermon. I only request you to change your text. Horace was a villain. Why do you quote Seneca, Tertullian, Origen, and Boethius? They were all heretics, and must, consequently, be considered by you as worse wretches than Horace, who, after all, never had the chance of becoming a Christian." However, as I saw it would please M. de Malipiero, I finally consented to accept, as a substitute for mine, a text offered by the abbé, although it did not suit in any way the spirit of my production, and in order to get an opportunity for a visit to his niece, I gave him my manuscript, saying that I would call for it the next day. My vanity prompted me to send a copy to Dr. Gozzi, but the good man caused me much amusement by returning it and writing that I must have gone mad, and that if I were allowed to deliver such a sermon from the pulpit, I would bring dishonour upon myself as well as upon the man who had educated me. I cared but little for his opinion, and on the appointed day I delivered my sermon in the Church of the Holy Sacrament, in the presence of the best society of Venice. I received much applause, and every one predicted that I would certainly become the first preacher of our century, as no young ecclesiastic of 15 had ever been known to preach as well as I had done. It is customary for the faithful to deposit their offerings for the preacher in a purse which is handed to them for that purpose. The sexton who emptied it of its contents found in it more than 50 sequins and several billets doux, to the great scandal of the weaker brethren. An anonymous note amongst them, the writer of which I thought I had guessed, led me into a mistake which I think better not to relate. This rich harvest and my great penury caused me to entertain serious thoughts of becoming a preacher, and I confided my intention to the parson, requesting his assistance to carry it into execution. This gave me the privilege of visiting at his house every day, and I improved the opportunity of conversing with Angela, for whom my love was daily increasing. But Angela was virtuous. She did not object to my love, but she wished me to renounce the church and to marry her. In spite of my infatuation for her, I could not make up my mind to such a step, and I went on seeing her and courting her in the hope that she would alter her decision. The priest, who had at last confessed his admiration for my first sermon, asked me some time afterwards to prepare another for St. Joseph's Day, with an invitation to deliver it on the 19th of March, 1741. I composed it, and the abbé spoke of it with enthusiasm, but fate had decided that I should never preach but once in my life. It is a sad tale, unfortunately for me very true, which some persons are cruel enough to consider very amusing. Young and rather self-conceited, I fancied that it was not necessary for me to spend much time in committing my sermon to memory. Being the author, I had all the ideas contained in my work classified in my mind, and it did not seem to me within the range of possibilities that I could forget what I had written. Perhaps I might not remember the exact words of a sentence, but I was at liberty to replace them by other expressions as good, and as I never happened to be at a loss, or to be struck dumb, when I spoke in society, it was not likely that such an untoward accident would befall me before an audience amongst whom I did not know anyone who could intimidate me and cause me suddenly to lose the faculty of reason or of speech. I therefore took my pleasure as usual, being satisfied with reading my sermon morning and evening, in order to impress it upon my memory, which until then had never betrayed me. The 19th of March came, and on that eventful day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon I was to ascend to the pulpit, but, believing myself quite secure and thoroughly master of my subject, I had not the moral courage to deny myself the pleasure of dining with Count Montreal, who was then residing with me, and who had invited the patrician Barozzi, engaged to be married to his daughter after the Easter holidays. I was still enjoying myself with my fine company when the sexton of the church came in to tell me that they were waiting for me in the vestry. With a full stomach and my head rather heated, I took my leave, ran to the church, and entered the pulpit. I went through the exordium with credit to myself, and I took breathing time. But scarcely had I pronounced the first sentences of the narration before I forgot what I was saying, what I had to say, and in my endeavours to proceed I fairly wandered from my subject, and I lost myself entirely. I was still more discomforted by a half-repressed murmur of the audience, as my deficiency appeared evident. Several persons left the church, others began to smile. I lost all presence of mind, and every hope of getting out of the scrape. I could not say whether I feigned a fainting fit, or whether I truly swooned. All I know is that I fell down on the floor of the pulpit, striking my head against the wall with an inward prayer for annihilation. 2 of the parish clerks carried me to the vestry, and after a few moments, without addressing a word to anyone, I took my cloak and my hat, and went home to lock myself in my room. I immediately dressed myself in a short coat, after the fashion of travelling priests. I packed a few things in a trunk, obtained some money from my grandmother, and took my departure of Padua, where I intended to pass my 3rd examination. I reached Padua at midnight, and went to Dr. Gozzi's house, but I did not feel the slightest temptation to mention to him my unlucky adventure. I remained in Padua long enough to prepare myself for the doctor's degree, which I intended to take the following year, and after Easter I returned to Venice, where my misfortune was already forgotten. But preaching was out of the question, and when any attempt was made to induce me to renew my efforts, I manfully kept to my determination never to ascend the pulpit again. On the eve of Ascension Day, M. Manzoni introduced me to a young courtesan who was at that time in great repute at Venice, and was nicknamed Cavamacchia, because her father had been a scourer. This name vexed her a great deal. She wished to be called Preati, which was her family name, but it was all in vain, and the only concession her friends would make was to call her by her Christian name of Juliet. She had been introduced to fashionable notice by the Marquis de Sanvitali, a nobleman from Parma, who had given her 100,000 ducats for her favours. Her beauty was then the talk of everybody in Venice, and it was fashionable to call upon her. To converse with her, and especially to be admitted into her circle, was considered a great boon. As I shall have to mention her several times in the course of my history, my readers will, I trust, allow me to enter into some particulars about her previous life. Juliet was only 14 years of age when her father sent her one day to the house of a Venetian nobleman, Marco Maurazzo, with a coat which he had cleaned for him. He thought her very beautiful in spite of the dirty rags in which she was dressed, and he called to see her at her father's shop, with a friend of his, the celebrated advocate Bastien Uccelli, who, struck by the romantic and cheerful nature of Juliet still more than by her beauty and fine figure, gave her an apartment, made her study music, and kept her as his mistress. At the time of the fair, Bastien took her with him to various public places of resort. Everywhere she attracted general attention, and secured the admiration of every lover of her sex. She made rapid progress in music, and at the end of 6 months she felt sufficient confidence in herself to sign an engagement with a theatrical manager, who took her to Vienna to give her a castrato part in one of Metastasio's operas. The advocate had previously ceded her to a wealthy Jew who, after giving her splendid diamonds, left her also. In Vienna, Juliet appeared on the stage, and her beauty gained for her an admiration which she would never have conquered by her very inferior talent. But the constant crowd of adorers who went to worship the goddess, having sounded her exploits rather too loudly, the august Maria Theresa objected to this new creed being sanctioned in the capital, and the beautiful actress received an order to quit Vienna forthwith. Count Spada offered her his protection and brought her back to Venice, but she soon left for Padua, where she had an engagement. In that city she kindled the fire of love in the breast of Marquis Sanvitali, but the Marchioness having caught her once in her own box, and Juliet having acted disrespectfully to her, she slapped her face, and the affair having caused a good deal of noise, Juliet gave up the stage altogether. She came back to Venice, where, made conspicuous by her banishment from Vienna, she could not fail to make her fortune. Expulsion from Vienna for this class of women had become a title to fashionable favor, and when there was a wish to depreciate a singer or a dancer, it was said of her that she had not been sufficiently prized to be expelled from Vienna. After her return, her first lover was Stefano Querini de Taponses, but in the spring of 1740 the Marquis de Sanvitali came to Venice and soon carried her off. It was indeed difficult to resist this delightful Marquis. His first present to the fair lady was the sum of 100,000 ducats, and to prevent his being accused of weakness or of lavish prodigality, he loudly proclaimed that the present could scarcely make up for the insult Juliet had received from his wife, an insult, however, which the courtesan never admitted, as she felt that there would be humiliation in such an acknowledgment, and she always professed to admire with gratitude her lover's generosity. She was right. The admission of the blow received would have left a stain upon her charms, and how much more to her taste to allow those charms to be prized at such a high figure. It was in the year 1741 that Manzoni introduced me to his new Phryne as a young ecclesiastic who was beginning to make a reputation. I found her surrounded by 7 or 8 well-seasoned admirers who were burning at her feet the incense of their flattery. She was carelessly reclining on a sofa near Querini. I was much struck with her appearance. She eyed me from head to foot as if I had been exposed for sale, and telling me with the air of a princess that she was not sorry to make my acquaintance, she invited me to take a seat. I began then, in my turn, to examine her closely and deliberately, and it was an easy matter, as the room, although small, was lighted with at least 20 wax candles. Juliet was then in her 18th year, the freshness of her complexion was dazzling, but the carnation tint of her cheeks, the vermilion of her lips, and the dark, very narrow curve of her eyebrows impressed me as being produced by art rather than nature. Her teeth, 2 rows of magnificent pearls, made one overlook the fact that her mouth was somewhat too large, and whether from habit or because she could not help it, she seemed to be ever smiling. Her bosom, hid under a light gauze, invited the desires of love. Yet I did not surrender to her charms. Her bracelets and the rings which covered her fingers did not prevent me from noticing that her hand was too large and too fleshy, and in spite of her carefully hiding her feet, I judged, by a telltale slipper lying close by her dress, that they were well proportioned to the height of her figure, proportion which is unpleasant not only to the Chinese and Spaniards, but likewise to every man of refined taste. We want a tall woman to have a small foot, and certainly it is not a modern taste, for Holofernes of old was of the same opinion, otherwise he would not have thought Judith so charming. Et sandalid ejus rapuerunt oculus ejus. Altogether I found her beautiful, but when I compared her beauty and the price of 100,000 ducats paid for it, I marveled at my remaining so cold, and at my not being tempted to give even 1 sequin for the privilege of making from nature a study of the charms which her dress concealed from my eyes. End of chapter 4, part A. Chapter 4, Part B of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 1, Childhood, Chapter 4b. I had scarcely been there a quarter of an hour when the noise made by the oars of a gondola striking the water heralded the prodigal Marquis. We all rose from our seats, and M. Querini hastened, somewhat blushing, to quit his place on the sofa. M. de Savintali, a man of middle age, who had travelled much, took a seat near Juliet, but not on the sofa, so she was compelled to turn around. It gave me the opportunity of seeing her full front, while I had before only a side view of her face. After my introduction to Juliet, I paid her 4 or 5 visits, and I thought myself justified, by the care I had given to the examination of her beauty, in saying in M. de Malipiero's drawing-room one evening, when my opinion about her was asked, that she could please only a glutton with depraved tastes, that she had neither the fascination of simple nature nor any knowledge of society, that she was deficient in well-bred, easy manners, as well as in striking talents, and that those were the qualities which a thorough gentleman liked to find in a woman. This opinion met the general approbation of his friends, but M. de Malipiero kindly whispered to me that Juliet would certainly be informed of the portrait I had drawn of her, and that she would become my sworn enemy. He had guessed rightly. I thought Juliet very singular, for she seldom spoke to me, and whenever she looked at me she made use of an eyeglass, or she contracted her eyelids, as if she wished to deny me the honour of seeing her eyes, which were beyond all dispute very beautiful. They were blue, wondrously large and full, and tinted with that unfathomable variegated iris which nature only gives to youth, and which generally disappears after having worked miracles when the owner reaches the shady side of 40. Frederick the Great preserved it until his death. Juliet was informed of the portrait I had given of her to M. de Malipiero's friends by the indiscreet pensioner Xavier Cortantini. One evening I called upon her with M. Manzoni, and she told him that a wonderful judge of beauty had found flaws in hers, but she took good care not to specify them. It was not difficult to make out that she was indirectly firing at me, and I prepared myself for the ostracism which I was expecting, but which, however, she kept in abeyance fully for an hour. At last, our conversation falling upon a concert given a few days before by Eimer, the actor, and in which his daughter, Thérèse, had taken a brilliant part, Juliet turned around to me and inquired what M. de Malipiero did for Thérèse. I said that he was educating her. "He can well do it," she answered, "for he is a man of talent, but I should like to know what he can do with you." "Whatever he can." "I am told that he thinks you rather stupid." As a matter of course, she had the laugh on her side, and I, confused, uncomfortable, and not knowing what to say, took leave after having cut a very sorry figure, and determined never again to darken her door. The next day, at dinner, the account of my adventure caused much amusement to the old senator. Throughout the summer I carried on a course of platonic love with my charming Angela at the house of her teacher of embroidery, but her extreme reserve excited me, and my love had almost become a torment to myself. With my ardent nature I required a mistress like Bettina, who knew how to satisfy my love without wearing it out. I still retained some feelings of purity, and I entertained the deepest veneration for Angela. She was, in my eyes, the very palladium of Cecrops. Still, very innocent, I felt some disinclination towards women, and I was simple enough to be jealous of even their husbands. Angela would not grant me the slightest favour, yet she was no flirt, but the fire beginning in me parched and withered me. The pathetic entreaties which I poured out of my heart had less effect on her than upon two young sisters, her companions and friends. Had I not concentrated every look of mine upon the heartless girl, I might have discovered that her friends excelled her in beauty and in feeling, but my prejudiced eyes saw no one but Angela. To every outpouring of my love she answered that she was quite ready to become my wife, and that such was to be the limit of my wishes. When she condescended to add that she suffered as much as I did myself, she thought she had bestowed upon me the greatest of favors. Such was the state of my mind when, in the first days of autumn, I received a letter from the Countess de Montreal, with an invitation to spend some time at her beautiful estate at Pasean. She expected many guests, and among them her own daughter, who had married a Venetian nobleman, and who had a great reputation for wit and beauty, although she had but one eye. But it was so beautiful that it made up for the loss of the other. I accepted the invitation, and Pasean offering me a constant round of pleasures, it was easy enough for me to enjoy myself, and to forget for the time the rigours of the cruel Angela. I was given a pretty room on the ground floor, opening upon the gardens of Pasean, and I enjoyed its comforts without caring to know who my neighbours were. The morning after my arrival, at the very moment I awoke, my eyes were delighted with the sight of the charming creature who brought me my coffee. She was a very young girl, but as well formed as a young person of 17, yet she had scarcely completed her 14th year. The snow of her complexion, her hair as dark as the raven's wing, her black eyes beaming with fire and innocence, her dress composed only of a chemise and a short petticoat which exposed a well-turned leg and the prettiest tiny foot, every detail I gathered in one instant presented to my looks the most original and the most perfect beauty I had ever beheld. I looked at her with the greatest pleasure, and her eyes rested upon me as if we had been old acquaintances. "How did you find your bed?" she asked. "Very comfortable. I am sure you made it. Pray, who are you?" "I am Lucy, the daughter of the gatekeeper. I have neither brothers nor sisters, and I am 14 years old. I am very glad you have no servant with you. I will be your little maid, and I am sure you will be pleased with me." Delighted at this beginning, I sat up in my bed, and she helped me to put on my dressing gown, saying 100 things which I did not understand. I began to drink my coffee, quite amazed at her easy freedom, and struck with her beauty, to which it would have been impossible to remain indifferent. She had seated herself on my bed, giving no other apology for that liberty than the most delightful smile. I was still sipping my coffee when Lucy's parents came into my room. She did not move from her place on the bed, but she looked at them, appearing very proud of such a seat. The good people kindly scolded her, begged my forgiveness in her favor, and Lucy left the room to attend to her other duties. The moment she had gone, her father and mother began to praise their daughter. "She is," they said, "our only child, our darling pet, the hope of our old age. She loves and obeys us, and fears God. She is as clean as a new pin, and has but one fault." "What is that?" "She is too young." "That is a charming fault which time will mend." I was not long in ascertaining that they were living specimens of honesty, of truth, of homely virtues, and of real happiness. I was delighted at this discovery when Lucy returned, as gay as a lark, prettily dressed, her hair done in a peculiar way of her own, and with well-fitting shoes. She dropped a simple curtsy before me, gave a couple of hearty kisses to both her parents, and jumped on her father's knees. I asked her to come and sit on my bed, but she answered that she could not take such a liberty now that she was dressed. The simplicity, artlessness, and innocence of her answer seemed to me very enchanting, and brought a smile on my lips. I examined her to see whether she was prettier in her new dress or in the morning's negligee, and I decided in favor of the latter. To speak the truth, Lucy was, I thought, superior in everything, not only to Angela, but even to Bettina. The hairdresser made his appearance, and the honest family left my room. When I was dressed, I went to meet the Countess and her amiable daughter. The day passed off very pleasantly, as is generally the case in the country when you are amongst agreeable people. In the morning, the moment my eyes were opened, I rang the bell, and pretty Lucy came in, simple and natural as before, with her easy manners and wonderful remarks. Her candor, her innocence shone brilliantly all over her person. I could not conceive how, with her goodness, her virtue, and her intelligence, she could run the risk of exciting me by coming into my room alone, and with so much familiarity. I fancied that she would not attach much importance to certain slight liberties, and would not prove over scrupulous, and with that idea I made up my mind to show her that I fully understood her. I felt no remorse of conscience on the score of her parents, who, in my estimation, were as careless as herself. I had no dread of being the first to give the alarm to her innocence, or to enlighten her mind with the gloomy light of malice, but, unwilling either to be the dupe of feeling or to act against it, I resolved to reconnoitre the ground. I extend a daring hand towards her person, and by an involuntary movement she withdraws, blushes, her cheerfulness disappears, and, turning her head aside as if she were in search of something, she waits until her agitation has subsided. The whole affair had not lasted 1 minute. She came back, abashed at the idea that she had proved herself rather knowing, and at the dread of having perhaps given a wrong interpretation to an action which might have been, on my part, perfectly innocent, or the result of politeness. Her natural laugh soon returned, and, having rapidly read in her mind all I have just described, I lost no time in restoring her confidence, and judging that I would venture too much by active operations, I resolved to employ the following morning in a friendly chat, during which I could make her out better. In pursuance of that plan, the next morning, as we were talking, I told her that it was cold, but she would not feel it if she would lie down near me. "Shall I disturb you?" she said. "No, but I am thinking that if your mother happened to come in, she would be angry." "Mother would not think of any harm." "Come, then. But, Lucy, do you know what danger you are exposing yourself to?" "Certainly I do, but you are good, and what is more, you are a priest." "Come, only lock the door." "No, no, for people might think I do not know what." She laid down close by me, and kept on her chatting, although I did not understand a word of what she said, for in that singular position, and unwilling to give way to my ardent desires, I remained as still as a log. Her confidence in her safety, confidence which was certainly not feigned, worked upon my feelings to such an extent that I would have been ashamed to take any advantage of it. At last she told me that 9 o'clock had struck, and that if old Count Antonio found us as we were, he would tease her with his jokes. "When I see that man," she said, "I'm afraid, and I run away." Saying these words, she rose from the bed and left the room. I remained motionless for a long while, stupefied, benumbed, and mastered by the agitation of my excited senses as well as by my thoughts. The next morning, as I wished to keep calm, I only let her sit down on my bed, and the conversation I had with her proved without the shadow of a doubt that her parents had every reason to idolize her, and that the easy freedom of her mind as well as of her behavior with me was entirely owing to her innocence and to her purity. Her artlessness, her vivacity, her eager curiosity, and the bashful blushes which spread over her face whenever her innocent or jesting remarks caused me to laugh, everything, in fact, convinced me that she was an angel destined to become the victim of the first libertine who would undertake to seduce her. I felt sufficient control over my feelings to resist any attempt against her virtue which my conscience might afterwards reproach me with. The mere thought of taking advantage of her innocence made me shudder, and my self-esteem was a guarantee to her parents, who abandoned her to me on the strength of my good opinion they entertained of me, that Lucy's honour was safe in my hands. I thought I would have despised myself if I had betrayed the trust they reposed on me. I therefore determined to conquer my feelings, and, with perfect confidence in the victory, I made up my mind to wage war against myself, and to be satisfied with her presence as the only reward of my heroic efforts. I was not yet acquainted with the axiom that, as long as the fighting lasts, victory remains uncertain. As I enjoyed her conversation much, a natural instinct prompted me to tell her that she would afford me great pleasure if she could come earlier in the morning, and even wake me up if I happened to be asleep, adding, in order to give more weight to my request, that the less I slept the better I felt in health. In this manner I contrived to spend 3 hours instead of 2 in her society, although this cunning contrivance of mine did not prevent the hours flying, at least in my opinion, as swift as lightning. Her mother would often come in as we were talking, and when the good woman found her sitting on my bed, she would say nothing, only wondering at my kindness. Lucie would then cover her with kisses, and the kind old soul would entreat me to give her child lessons of goodness, and to cultivate her mind. But when she had left us, Lucie did not think herself more unrestrained, and whether in or out of her mother's presence, she was always the same without the slightest change. If the society of this angelic child afforded me the sweetest delight, it also caused me the most cruel suffering. Often, very often, when her face was close to my lips, I felt the most ardent temptation to smother her with kisses, and my blood was at fever heat when she wished that she had been a sister of mine. But I kept sufficient command over myself to avoid the slightest contact, for I was conscious that even one kiss would have been the spark which would have blown up all the edifice of my reserve. Every time she left me, I remained astounded at my own victory, but, always eager to win fresh laurels, I longed for the following morning, panting for a renewal of this sweet yet very dangerous contest. At the end of 10 or 12 days, I felt that there was no alternative but to put a stop to this state of things, or to become a monster in my own eyes, and I decided for the moral side of the question all the more easily that nothing ensured me success if I chose the second alternative. The moment I placed her under the obligation to defend herself, Lucy would become a heroine, and the door of my room being open, I might have been exposed to shame and to a very useless repentance. This rather frightened me, yet to put an end to my torture I did not know what to decide. I could no longer resist the effect made upon my senses by this beautiful girl, who at the break of day and scarcely dressed, ran gaily into my room, came to my bed, inquiring how I had slept, bent familiarly her head towards me, and, so to speak, dropped her words on my lips. In those dangerous moments I would turn my head aside, but in her innocence she would reproach me for being afraid when she felt herself so safe, and if I answered that I could not possibly fear a child, she would reply that a difference of 2 years was of no account. Standing at bay, exhausted, conscious that every instant increased the ardor which was devouring me, I resolved to entreat from herself the discontinuance of her visits, and this resolution appeared to me sublime and infallible. But having postponed its execution until the following morning, I passed a dreadful night, tortured by the image of Lucie and by the idea that I would see her in the morning for the last time. I fancied that Lucie would not only grant my prayer, but that she would conceive for me the highest esteem. In the morning it was barely daylight, Lucie beaming, radiant with beauty, a happy smile brightening her pretty mouth, and her splendid hair in the most fascinating disorder, bursts into my room and rushes with open arms towards my bed. But when she sees my pale, dejected, and unhappy countenance, she stops short, and her beautiful face taking an expression of sadness and anxiety. "What ails you?" she asks, with deep sympathy. "I have had no sleep through the night." "And why?" "Because I have made up my mind to impart to you a project which, although fraught with misery to myself, will at least secure me your esteem." "But if your project is to ensure my esteem, it ought to make you very cheerful. Only tell me, reverend sir, why, after calling me thou yesterday, you treat me today respectfully like a lady. What have I done? I will get your coffee, and you must tell me everything after you have drunk it. I long to hear you." She goes and returns. I drink the coffee, and seeing that my countenance remains grave, she tries to enliven me, contrives to make me smile, and claps her hands for joy. After putting everything in order, she closes the door because the wind is high, and in her anxiety not to lose one word of what I have to say, she entreats artlessly a little place near me. I cannot refuse her, for I feel almost lifeless. I then begin a faithful recital of the fearful state in which her beauty has thrown me, and a vivid picture of all the suffering I have experienced in trying to master my ardent wish to give her some proof of my love. I explain to her that, unable to endure such torture any longer, I see no other safety but in entreating her not to see me any more. The importance of the subject, the truth of my love, my wish to present my expedient in the light of her heroic effort of a deep and virtuous passion, lend me a peculiar eloquence. I endeavor above all to make her realize the fearful consequences which might follow a course different to the one I was proposing, and how miserable we might be. At the close of my long discourse, Lucie, seeing my eyes wet with tears, throws off the bedclothes to wipe them, without thinking that in so doing she uncovers 2 globes, the beauty of which might have caused the wreck of the most experienced pilot. After a short silence, the charming child tells me that my tears make her very unhappy, and that she had never supposed that she could cause them. "All that you have just told me," she added, "proves the sincerity of your great love for me, but I cannot imagine why you should be in such a dread of a feeling which affords me the most intense pleasure. You wish to banish me from your presence because you stand in fear of your love. But what would you do if you hated me? Am I guilty because I have pleased you? If it is a crime to have won your affection, I can assure you that I did not think I was committing a criminal action, and therefore you cannot conscientiously punish me. Yet I cannot conceal the truth. I am very happy to be loved by you. As for the danger we run, When we love danger which I can understand, we can set it at defiance. If we choose, and I wonder at my not fearing it, ignorant as I am, while you, a learned man, think it so terrible. I am astonished that love, which is not a disease, should have made you ill, and that it should have exactly the opposite effect upon me. Is it possible that I am mistaken, and that my feelings toward you should not be love? You saw me very cheerful when I came in this morning. It is because I have been dreaming all night, but my dreams did not keep me awake. Only several times I woke up to ascertain whether my dream was true, for I thought I was near you, and every time, finding that it was not so, I quickly went to sleep again in the hope of continuing my happy dream, and every time I succeeded. After such a night, was it not natural for me to be cheerful this morning? My dear Abbé, if love is a torment for you, I am very sorry, but would it be possible for you to live without love? I will do anything you order me to do, but even if your cure depended upon it, I would not cease to love you, for that would be impossible. Yet if to heal your sufferings it should be necessary for you to love me no more, you must do your utmost to succeed, for I would much rather see you alive without love than dead for having loved too much. Only try to find some other plan, for the one you have proposed makes me very miserable. Think of it, there may be some other way which will be less painful. Suggest one more practicable, and depend upon Lucy's obedience. These words, so true, so artless, so innocent, made me realize the immense superiority of nature's eloquence over that of philosophical intellect. For the first time I folded this angelic being in my arms, exclaiming, "Yes, dearest Lucy, yes, thou hast it in thy power to afford the sweetest relief to my devouring pain. Abandon to my ardent kisses thy divine lips, which have just assured me of thy love." An hour passed in the most delightful silence, which nothing interrupted, except these words murmured now and then by Lucy. "Oh God, is it true? Is it not a dream?" Yet I respected her innocence, and the more readily that she abandoned herself entirely and without the slightest resistance. At last, extricating herself gently from my arms, she said, with some uneasiness, "My heart begins to speak, I must go," and she instantly rose. Having somewhat rearranged her dress, she sat down, and her mother, coming in at that moment, complimented me upon my good looks and my bright countenance, and told Lucy to dress herself to attend mass. Lucy came back an hour later, and expressed her joy and her pride at the wonderful cure she thought she had performed upon me, for the healthy appearance I was then showing convinced her of my love much better than the pitiful state in which she had found me in the morning. "If your complete happiness," she said, "rests in my power, be happy. There is nothing that I can refuse you." The moment she left me, still wavering between happiness and fear, I understood that I was standing on the very brink of the abyss, and that nothing but a most extraordinary determination would prevent me from falling headlong into it. I remained at Pasean until the end of September, and the last 11 nights of my stay were passed in the undisturbed possession of Lucy, who, secure in her mother's profound sleep, came to my room to enjoy in my arms the most delicious hours. The burning ardor of my love was increased by the abstinence to which I condemned myself, although Lucy did everything in her power to make me break through my determination. She could not fully enjoy the sweetness of the forbidden fruit unless I plucked it without reserve, and the effect produced by our constantly lying in each other's arms was too strong for a young girl to resist. She tried everything she could to deceive me, and to make me believe that I had already, and in reality, gathered the whole flower, but Bettina's lessons had been too efficient to allow me to go on a wrong scent, and I reached the end of my stay without yielding entirely to the temptation she so fondly threw in my way. I promised her to return in the spring. Our farewell was tender and very sad, and I left her in a state of mind and of body which must have been the cause of her misfortunes, which, 20 years after, I had occasion to reproach myself with in Holland, and which will ever remain upon my conscience. After a few days after my return to Venice, I had fallen back into all my old habits, and resumed my courtship of Angela in the hope that I would obtain from her at least as much as Lucy had granted to me. A certain dread, which today I can no longer trace in my nature, a sort of terror of the consequences which might have a blighting influence upon my future, prevented me from giving myself up to complete enjoyment. I do not know whether I have ever been a truly honest man, but I am fully aware that the feelings I fostered in my youth were by far more upright than those I have, as I lived on, forced upon myself to accept. A wicked philosophy throws down too many of these barriers, which we call prejudices. The two sisters who were sharing Angela's embroidery lessons were her intimate friends and the confidants of all her secrets. I made their acquaintance and found that they disapproved of her extreme reserve towards me. As I usually saw them with Angela and knew their intimacy with her, I would, when I happened to meet them alone, tell them all my sorrows, and thinking only of my cruel sweetheart, I never was conceited enough to propose that these young girls might fall in love with me. But I often ventured to speak to them with all the blazing inspiration which was burning in me, a liberty I would not have dared to take in the presence of her whom I loved. True love always begets reserve. We feared to be accused of exaggeration if we should give utterance to feelings inspired by passion, and the modest lover, in his dread of saying too much, very often says too little. The teacher of embroidery, an old bigot, who at first appeared not to mind the attachment I shewed for Angela, got tired at last of my too frequent visits, and mentioned them to the abbé, the uncle of my fair lady. He told me kindly one day that I ought not to call at that house so often, as my constant visits might be wrongly construed and prove detrimental to the reputation of his niece. His words fell upon me like a thunderbolt, but I mastered my feelings sufficiently to leave him without incurring any suspicion, and I promised to follow his good advice. 3 or 4 days afterwards I paid a visit to the teacher of embroidery, and to make her believe that my visit was only intended for her, I did not stop one instant near the young girls. Yet I contrived to slip in the hand of the eldest of the two sisters a note enclosing another for my dear Angela, in which I explained why I had been compelled to discontinue my visits, entreating her to devise some means by which I could enjoy the happiness of seeing her and of conversing with her. In my note to Nanette I only begged her to give my letter to her friend, adding that I would see them again the day after the morrow, and that I trusted to her to find an opportunity for delivering me the answer. She managed it all very cleverly, and when I renewed my visit 2 days afterwards, she gave me a letter without attracting the attention of anyone. Nanette's letter enclosed a very short note from Angela, who, disliking letter writing, merely advised me to follow, if I could, the plan proposed by her friend. Here is the copy of the letter written by Nanette, which I have always kept, as well as all other letters which I give in these memoirs. There is nothing in the world, reverend sir, that I would not readily do for my friend. She visits at our house every holiday, has supper with us, and sleeps under our roof. I will suggest the best way for you to make the acquaintance of Madame Orio, our aunt. But if you obtain an introduction to her, you must be very careful not to let her suspect your preference for Angela, for our aunt would certainly object to her house being made a place of rendezvous to facilitate your interviews with a stranger to her family. Now for the plan I propose, and in the execution of which I will give you every assistance in my power. Madame Orio, although a woman of good station in life, is not wealthy, and she wishes to have her name entered on the list of noble widows who receive the bounties bestowed by the Confraternity of the Holy Sacrament, of which M. de Malipiero is president. Last Sunday Angela mentioned that you are in the good graces of that nobleman, and that the best way to obtain his patronage would be to ask you to entreat it in her behalf. The foolish girl added that you were smitten with me, that all your visits to our mistress of embroidery were made for my special benefit and for the sake of entertaining me, and that I would find it very easy task to interest you in her favor. My aunt answered that, as you are a priest, there was no fear of any harm, and she told me to write to you with an invitation to call on her. I refused. The procurator Rosa, who is a great favorite of my aunt's, was present. He approved of my refusal, saying that the letter ought to be written by her and not by me, that it was for my aunt to beg the honor of your visit on business of real importance, and that if there was any truth in the report of your love for me, you would not fail to come. My aunt, by his advice, has therefore written the letter which you will find at your house. If you wish to meet Angela, postpone your visit to us until next Sunday. Should you succeed in obtaining M. de Malipiero's goodwill in favor of my aunt, you will become the pet of the household. But you must forgive me if I appear to treat you with coolness, for I have said that I do not like you. I would advise you to make love to my aunt, who is 60 years of age. M. Rosa will not be jealous, and you will become dear to everyone. For my part, I will manage for you an opportunity for some private conversation with Angela, and I will do anything to convince you of my friendship. Adieu. This plan appeared to me very well conceived, and having the same evening received Madame Orio's letter, I called upon her on the following day, Sunday. I was welcomed in a very friendly manner, and the lady, in entreating me to exert in her behalf my influence with M. de Malipiero, entrusted me with all the papers which I might require to succeed. I undertook to do my utmost, and I took care to address only a few words to Angela, but I directed all my gallant attentions to Nanette, who treated me as coolly as could be. Finally, I won the friendship of the old procurator Rosa, who in after years was of some service to me. I had so much at stake in the success of Madame Orio's petition that I thought of nothing else, and knowing all the power of the beautiful Thérèse Aymer over our amorous senator, who would be but too happy to please her in anything, I determined to call upon her the next day, and I went straight to her room without being announced. I found her alone with the physician Doro, who, feigning to be on a professional visit, wrote a prescription, felt her purse, and went off. This Doro was suspected of being in love with Thérèse. M. de Malipiero, who was jealous, had forbidden Thérèse to receive his visits, and she had promised to obey him. She knew that I was acquainted with those circumstances, and my presence was evidently unpleasant to her, for she had certainly no wish that the old man should hear how she kept her promise. I thought that no better opportunity could be found of obtaining from her everything I wished. I told her in a few words the object of my visit, and I took care to add that she could rely upon my discretion, and that I would not for the world do her any injury. Thérèse, grateful for this assurance, answered that she rejoiced at finding an occasion to oblige me, and asking me to give her the papers of my protégé, she shewed me the certificates and testimonials of another lady in favour of whom she had undertaken to speak, and whom she said she would sacrifice to the person in whose behalf I felt interested. She kept her word, for the very next day she placed in my hands the brevet signed by His Excellency as President of the Confraternity. For the present, and with the expectation of further favours, Madame Orio's name was put down to share the bounties which were distributed twice a year. Nanette and her sister Martin were the orphan daughters of a sister of Madame Orio. All the fortune of the good lady consisted in the house which was her dwelling, the first floor being let, and in a pension given to her by her brother, member of the Council of 10. She lived alone with her 2 charming nieces, the eldest 16 and the youngest 15 years of age. She kept no servant, and only employed an old woman who, for 1 crown a month, fetched water and did the rough work. Her only friend was the procurator Rosa. He had, like her, reached his 60th year, and expected to marry her as soon as she should become a widower. The 2 sisters slept together on the 3rd floor in a large bed, which was likewise shared by Angela every Sunday. As soon as I found myself in possession of the deed for Madame Orio, I hastened to pay a visit to the mistress of embroidery, in order to find an opportunity of acquainting Nanette with my success, and in a short note which I prepared, I informed her that in 2 days I would call to give the brevet to Madame Orio, and I begged her earnestly not to forget her promise to contrive a private interview with my dear Angela. When I arrived on the appointed day at Madame Orio's house, Nanette, who had watched for my coming, dexterously conveyed to my hand a billet, requesting me to find a moment to read it before leaving the house. I found Madame Orio, Angela, the old procurator, and Martin in the room. Longing to read the note, I refused the seat offered to me, and presenting to Madame Orio the deed she had so long desired, I asked, as my only reward, the pleasure of kissing her hand, giving her to understand that I wanted to leave the room immediately. "Oh, my dear Abbé," said the lady, "you shall have a kiss, but not on my hand, and no one can object to it, as I am 30 years older than you." She might have said 45 without much astray. I gave her 2 kisses, which evidently satisfied her, for she desired me to perform the same ceremony with her nieces, but they both ran away, and Angela alone stood the brunt of my hardihood. After this, the widow asked me to sit down. "I cannot, madame." "Why, I beg?" I understand. Nanette, show the way." "Dear aunt, excuse me." "Well, then, Martin." "Oh, dear aunt, why do you not insist upon my sister obeying your orders?" "Alas, madame, these young ladies are quite right. Allow me to retire." "No, my dear abbé, my nieces are very foolish, and Rosa, I am sure, will kindly." The good procurator takes me affectionately by the hand, and leads me to the 3rd story, where he leaves me. The moment I am alone, I open my letter, and I read the following: "My aunt will invite you to supper. Do not accept. Go away as soon as we sit down to the table, and Martin will escort you as far as the street door. But do not leave the house. When the street door is closed again, everyone thinking you are gone, go upstairs in the dark as far as the 3rd floor, where you must wait for us. We will come up the moment M. Rosa has left the house, and our aunt has gone to bed. Angela will be at liberty to grant you throughout the night a tete-a-tete, which I entrust will prove a happy one. Oh, what joy, what gratitude for the lucky chance which allowed me to read this letter on the very spot where I was to expect the dear object of my love! Certain of finding my way without the slightest difficulty, I returned to Madame Orio's sitting room, overwhelmed with happiness. End of chapter 4b. Chapter 5, Part A of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova, Episode 1, Childhood, Chapter 5, Part A. An unlucky night, I fall in love with the two sisters and forget Angela, a ball at my house, Juliet's humiliation, my return to Pasean, Lucy's misfortune, a propitious storm. On my reappearance, Madame Orio told me, with many heartfelt thanks, that I must for the future consider myself as a privileged and welcome friend, and the evening passed off very pleasantly. As the hour for supper drew near, I excused myself so well that Madame Orio could not insist upon my accepting her invitation to stay. Martin rose to light me out of the room, but her aunt, believing Nanette to be my favorite, gave her such an imperative order to accompany me that she was compelled to obey. She went down the stairs rapidly, opened and closed the street door very noisily, and putting her light out, she re-entered the sitting room, leaving me in darkness. I went upstairs softly. When I reached the third landing, I found the chamber of the two sisters, and throwing myself upon a sofa, I waited patiently for the rising of the star of my happiness. An hour passed amidst the sweetest dreams of my imagination. At last I hear the noise of the street door opening and closing, and a few minutes after the two sisters come in with my Angela. I draw her towards me, and caring for nobody else, I keep up for 2 full hours my conversation with her. The clock strikes midnight. I am pitied for having gone so late supperless, but I am shocked at such an idea. I answer that, with such happiness as I am enjoying, I can suffer from no human want. I am told that I am a prisoner, that the key of the house door is under the aunt's pillow, and that it is opened only by herself as she goes in the morning to the first mass. I wonder at my young friend's imagining that such news can be anything but delightful to me. I express all my joy at the certainty of passing the next 5 hours with the beloved mistress of my heart. Another hour is spent, when suddenly Nanette begins to laugh. Angela wants to know the reason, and Martin, whispering a few words to her, they both laugh likewise. This puzzles me. In my turn, I want to know what causes this general laughter, and at last Nanette, putting on an air of anxiety, tells me that they have no more candle, and that in a few minutes we shall be in the dark. This is a piece of news particularly agreeable to me, but I do not let my satisfaction appear on my countenance, and saying how truly I am sorry for their sake, I propose that they should go to bed and sleep quietly under my respectful guardianship. My proposal increases their merriment. What can we do in the dark? We can talk. We were four. For the last 3 hours we had been talking, and I was the hero of the romance. Love is a great poet. Its resources are inexhaustible, but if the end it has in view is not obtained, it feels weary and remains silent. My Angela listened willingly, but little disposed to talk herself. She seldom answered, and she displayed good sense rather than wit. To weaken the force of my arguments, she was often satisfied with hurling at me a proverb, somewhat in the fashion of the Romans throwing the catapult. Every time that my poor hands came to the assistance of love, she drew herself back or repulsed me. Yet in spite of all I went on talking and using my hands without losing courage. But I gave myself up to despair when I found that my rather artful arguing astounded her without bringing conviction to her heart, which was only disquieted, never softened. On the other hand, I could see with astonishment upon their countenances the impression made upon the two sisters by the ardent speeches I poured out to Angela. This metaphysical curve struck me as unnatural. It ought to have been an angle. I was then, unhappily for myself, studying geometry. I was in such a state that, notwithstanding the cold, I was perspiring profusely. At last the light was nearly out, and Nanette took it away. The moment we were in the dark, I very naturally extended my arms to seize her whom I loved, but I only met with empty space, and I could not help laughing at the rapidity with which Angela had availed herself of the opportunity of escaping me. For 1 full hour I poured out all the tender, cheerful words that love inspired me with, to persuade her to come back to me. I could only suppose that it was a joke to tease me, but I became impatient. "The joke," I said, "has lasted long enough. It is foolish, as I could not run after you, and I am surprised to hear you laugh, for your strange conduct leads me to suppose that you are making fun of me. Come and take your seat near me, and, if I must speak to you without seeing you, let my hands assure me that I am not addressing my words to the empty air. To continue this game would be an insult to me, and my love does not deserve such a return. Well, be calm. I will listen to every word you may say, but you must feel that it would not be decent for me to place myself near you in this dark room. Do you want me to stand where I am until morning? Lie down on the bed and go to sleep. I wonder, indeed, at your thinking me capable of doing so in the state I am in. Well, I suppose we must play at blind man's buff." Thereupon I began to feel right and left everywhere, but in vain. Whenever I caught anyone, it always turned out to be Nanette or Martin, who at once discovered themselves, and I, stupid Don Quixote, instantly would let them go. Love and prejudice blinded me. I could not see how ridiculous I was with my respectful reserve. I had not yet read the anecdotes of Louis XIII, King of France, but I had read Boccaccio. I kept on seeking in vain, reproaching her with her cruelty, and entreating her to let me catch her, but she would only answer that the difficulty of meeting each other was mutual. The room was not large, and I was enraged at my want of success. Tired and still more vexed, I sat down, and for the next hour I told the history of Roger, when Angelica disappears through the power of the magic ring, which the loving knight had so imprudently given her. Così dicendo, intorno alla fortuna, brancolando n'andava come cieco. O quante volte abbracciò l'aria vana, speyando la donzella abbracciar seco. Angela had not read Ariosto, but Nanette had done so several times. She undertook the defence of Angelica, and blamed the simplicity of Roger, who, if he had been wise, would never have trusted the ring to a coquette. I was delighted with Nanette, but I was yet too much of a novice to apply her remarks to myself. Only one more hour remained, and I was to leave before the break of day, for Madame Orio would have died rather than give way to the temptation of missing the early mass. During that hour I spoke to Angela, trying to convince her that she ought to come and sit by me. My soul went through every gradation of hope and despair, and the reader cannot possibly realize it unless he has been placed in a similar position. I exhausted the most convincing arguments. Then I had recourse to prayers, and even to tears, but seeing all was useless, I gave way to that feeling of noble indignation which lends dignity to anger. Had I not been in the dark, I might, I truly believe, have struck the proud monster. The cruel girl who had thus for 5 hours condemned me to the most distressing suffering. I poured out all the abuse, all the insulting words that despised love can suggest to an infuriated mind. I loaded her with the deepest curses. I swore that my love had entirely turned into hatred, and, as a finale, I advised her to be careful, as I would kill her the moment I would set my eyes on her. My invectives came to an end with the darkness. At the first break of day, and as soon as I heard the noise made by the bolt and the key of the street door, which Madame Orio was opening to let herself out, that she might seek in the church the repose of which her pious soul was in need, I got myself ready and looked for my cloak and for my hat. But how can I ever portray the consternation in which I was thrown when, casting a sly glance upon the young friends, I found the 3 bathed in tears. In my shame and despair, I thought of committing suicide, and sitting down again, I recollected my brutal speeches, and upbraided myself for having wantonly caused them to weep. I could not say one word. I felt choking. At last tears came to my assistance, and I gave way to a fit of crying, which relieved me. Nanette then remarked that her aunt would soon return home. I dried my eyes, and, not venturing another look at Angela or at her friends, I ran away without uttering a word, and threw myself on my bed, where sleep would not visit my troubled mind. At noon, M. de Malipiero, noticing the change in my countenance, inquired what ailed me, and longing to unburden my heart, I told him all that had happened. The wise old man did not laugh at my sorrow, but by his sensible advice he managed to console me and to give me courage. He was in the same predicament with the beautiful Thérèse. Yet he could not help giving way to his merriment when at dinner he saw me, in spite of my grief, eat with increased appetite. I had gone without my supper the night before. He complimented me upon my happy constitution. I was determined never to visit Madame Orio's house, and on that very day I held an argument in metaphysics, in which I contended that any being of whom we had only an abstract idea could only exist abstractedly, and I was right, but it was a very easy task to give to my thesis an irreligious turn, and I was obliged to recant. A few days afterwards I went to Padua, where I took my degree of doctor utroque jure. When I returned to Venice, I received a note from M. Rosa, who entreated me to call upon Madame Orio. She wished to see me, and, feeling certain of not meeting Angela, I paid her a visit the same evening. The 2 graceful sisters were so kind, so pleasant, that they scattered to the winds the shame I felt at seeing them after the fearful night I had passed in their room 2 months before. The labors of writing my thesis and passing my examination were of course sufficient excuses for Madame Orio, who only wanted to reproach me for having remained so long away from her house. As I left, Nanette gave me a letter containing a note from Angela, the contents of which ran as follows: "If you are not afraid of passing another night with me, you shall have no reason to complain of me, for I love you, and I wish to hear from your own lips whether you would still have loved me if I had consented to become contemptible in your eyes." This is the letter of Nanette, who alone had her wits about her. M. Rosa having undertaken to bring you back to our house, I prepare these few lines to let you know that Angela is in despair at having lost you. I confess that the night you spent with us was a cruel one, but I do not think that you did rightly in giving up your visits to Madame Orio. If you still feel any love for Angela, I advise you to take your chances once more. Accept the rendezvous for another night, she may vindicate herself, and you will be happy. Believe me. Come. Farewell." Those 2 letters afforded me much gratification, for I had it in my power to enjoy my revenge by showing to Angela the coldest contempt. Therefore, on the following Sunday, I went to Madame Orio's house, having provided myself with a smoked tongue and a couple of bottles of Cyprus wine. But to my great surprise, my cruel mistress was not there. Nanette told me that she had met her at church in the morning, and that she would not be able to come before supper time. Trusting to that promise, I declined Madame Orio's invitation, and before the family sat down to supper, I left the room as I had done on the former occasion, and slipped upstairs. I longed to represent the character I had prepared myself for, and feeling assured that Angela, even if she should prove less cruel, would only grant me insignificant favours, I despised them in anticipation, and resolved to be avenged. After waiting 3/4 of an hour, the street door was locked, and a moment later Nanette and Martin entered the room. "Where is Angela?" I inquired. "She must have been unable to come, or to send a message, yet she knows you are here. She thinks she has made a fool of me, but I suspected she would act in this way. You know her now. She is trifling with me, and very likely she is now revelling in her triumph. She has made use of you to allure me in the snare, and it is all the better for her. Had she come, I meant to have had my turn, and to have laughed at her." "Ah, you must allow me to have my doubts as to that." "Doubt me not, beautiful Nanette. The pleasant night we are going to spend without her must convince you. That is to say that, as a man of sense, you can accept us as a makeshift, but you can sleep here, and my sister can lie with me on the sofa in the next room. I cannot hinder you, but it would be great unkindness on your part. At all events, I do not intend to go to bed." "What! You would have the courage to spend 7 hours alone with us? Why, I am certain that in a short time you will be at a loss what to say, and you will fall asleep." "Well, we shall see. In the meantime, here are provisions. You will not be so cruel as to let me eat alone. Can you get any bread?" "Yes, and to please you we must have a second supper. I ought to be in love with you. Tell me, beautiful Nanette, if I were as much attached to you as I was to Angela, would you follow her example and make me unhappy?" "How can you ask such a question? It is worthy of a conceited man. All I can answer is, that I do not know what I would do." They laid the cloth, brought some bread, some Parmesan cheese and water, laughing all the while, and then we went to work. The wine, to which they were not accustomed, went to their heads, and their gaiety was soon delightful. I wondered, as I looked at them, at my having been blind enough not to see their merit. After our supper, which was delicious, I sat between them, holding their hands, which I pressed to my lips, asking them whether they were truly my friends, and whether they approved of Angela's conduct towards me. They both answered that it had made them shed many tears. "Then let me," I said, "have for you the tender feelings of a brother, and share those feelings yourselves as if you were my sisters. Let us exchange in all innocence proofs of our mutual affection, and swear to each other an eternal fidelity." The first kiss I gave them was prompted by entirely harmless motives, and they returned the kiss, as they assured me a few days afterwards, only to prove to me that they reciprocated my brotherly feelings. But those innocent kisses, as we repeated them, very soon became ardent ones, and kindled a flame which certainly took us by surprise, for we stopped, as by common consent, after a short time, looking at each other very much astonished and rather serious. They both left me without affectation, and I remained alone with my thoughts. Indeed, it was natural that the burning kisses I had given and received should have sent through me the fire of passion, and that I should suddenly have fallen madly in love with the two amiable sisters. Both were handsomer than Angela, and they were superior to her. Nanette by her charming wit, Martin by her sweet and simple nature. I could not understand how I had been so long in rendering them the justice they deserved, but they were the innocent daughters of a noble family, and the lucky chance which had thrown them in my way ought not to prove a calamity for them. I was not vain enough to suppose that they loved me, but I could well enough admit that my kisses had influenced them in the same manner that their kisses had influenced me, and, believing this to be the case, it was evident that, with a little cunning on my part, and of sly practices of which they were ignorant, I could easily, during the long night I was going to spend with them, obtain favours, the consequences of which might be very positive. The very thought made me shudder, and I firmly resolved to respect their virtue, never dreaming that circumstances might prove too strong for me. When they returned, I read upon their countenances perfect security and satisfaction, and I quickly put on the same appearance, with a full determination not to expose myself again to the danger of their kisses. For 1 hour we spoke of Angela, and I expressed my determination never to see her again, as I had every proof that she did not care for me. "She loves you," said the artless Martin. "I know she does, but if you do not mean to marry her, you will do well to give up all intercourse with her, for she is quite determined not to grant you even a kiss as long as you are not her acknowledged suitor. You must therefore either give up the acquaintance altogether, or make up your mind that she will refuse you everything." "You argue very well, but how do you know that she loves me?" "I am quite sure of it, and as you have promised to be our brother, I can tell you why I have that conviction. When Angela is in bed with me, she embraces me lovingly, and calls me her dear abbé." The words were scarcely spoken when Nanette, laughing heartily, placed her hand on her sister's lips, but the innocent confession had such an effect upon me that I could hardly control myself. Martin told Nanette that I could not possibly be ignorant of what takes place between young girls sleeping together. "There is no doubt," I said, "that everybody knows those trifles, and I do not think, dear Nanette, that you ought to reproach your sister with indiscretion for her friendly confidence. It cannot be helped now, but such things ought not to be mentioned. If Angela knew it! She would be vexed, of course, but Martin has given me a mark of her friendship which I never can forget. But it is all over. I hate Angela, and I do not mean to speak to her any more. She is false, and she wishes my ruin. Yet, loving you, is she wrong to think of having you for her husband? Granted that she is not, but she thinks only of her own self, for she knows what I suffer, and her conduct would be very different if she loved me. In the meantime, thanks to her imagination, she finds the means of satisfying her senses with the charming Martin, who kindly performs the part of her husband. Nanette laughed louder, but I kept very serious, and I went on talking to her sister and praising her sincerity. I said that very likely, and to reciprocate her kindness, Angela must likewise have been her husband, but she answered with a smile that Angela played husband only to Nanette, and Nanette could not deny it. "But," said I, "what name did Nanette, in her rapture, give to her husband?" "Nobody knows." "Do you love anyone, Nanette?" "I do, but my secret is my own." This reserve gave me the suspicion that I had something to do with her secret, and that Nanette was the rival of Angela. Such a delightful conversation caused me to lose the wish of passing an idle night with two girls so well made for love. "It is very lucky," I exclaimed, "that I have for you only feelings of friendship. Otherwise it would be very hard to pass the night without giving way to the temptation of bestowing upon you proofs of my affection, for you are both so lovely, so bewitching, that you would turn the brains of any man." As I went on talking I pretended to be somewhat sleepy. Nanette, being the first to notice it, said, "Go to bed without any ceremony, we will lie down on the sofa in the adjoining room." I would be a very poor spirited fellow indeed if I agreed to this. "Let us talk. My sleepiness will soon pass off, but I am anxious about you. Go to bed yourselves, my charming friends, and I will go into the next room. If you are afraid of me, lock the door, but you would do me an injustice, for I feel only a brother's yearnings towards you." "We cannot accept such an arrangement," said Nanette, "but let me persuade you. Take this bed." "I cannot sleep with my clothes on." "Undress yourself, we would not look at you." "I have no fear of it, but how could I find the heart to sleep while on my account you are compelled to sit up?" "Well," said Martin, "we can lie down too without undressing." "If you show me such distrust, you will offend me. Tell me, Nanette, do you think I am an honest man?" "Most certainly." "Well, then, give me a proof of your good opinion. Lie down near me in the bed, undressed, and rely on my word of honor that I will not even lay a finger upon you. Besides, you are two against one. What can you fear? Will you not be free to get out of the bed in case I should not keep quiet? In short, unless you consent to give me this mark of your confidence in me, at least when I have fallen asleep, I cannot go to bed." I said no more, and pretended to be very sleepy. They exchanged a few words, whispering to each other, and Martin told me to go to bed, that they would follow me as soon as I was asleep. Nanette made me the same promise. I turned my back to them, undressed myself quickly, and wishing them good night, I went to bed. I immediately pretended to fall asleep, but soon I dozed in good earnest, and only woke when they came to bed. Then, turning round as if I wished to resume my slumbers, I remained very quiet until I could suppose them fast asleep. At all events, if they did not sleep, they were at liberty to pretend to do so. Their backs were towards me, and the light was out. Therefore I could only act at random, and I paid my first compliments to the one who was lying on my right, not knowing whether she was Nanette or Martin. I find her bent in two, and wrapped up in the only garment she had kept on. Taking my time and sparing her modesty, I compel her by degrees to acknowledge her defeat and convince her that it is better to feign sleep and to let me proceed. Her natural instincts soon working in concert with mine, I reached the goal. and my efforts, crowned with the most complete success, leave me not the shadow of a doubt that I have gathered those first fruits to which our prejudice makes us attach so great an importance. Enraptured at having enjoyed my manhood completely and for the first time, I quietly leave my beauty in order to do homage to the other sister. I find her motionless, lying on her back like a person wrapped in profound and undisturbed slumber. Carefully manage my advance, as if I were afraid of waking her up. I begin by gently gratifying her senses, and I ascertain the delightful fact that, like her sister, she is still in possession of her maidenhood. As soon as a natural movement proves to me that love accepts the offering, I take my measure to consummate the sacrifice. At that moment, giving way suddenly to the violence of her feelings, and tired of her assumed dissimulation, she warmly locks me in her arms at the very instant of the voluptuous crisis, smothers me with kisses, shares my raptures, and love blends our souls in the most ecstatic enjoyment. Guessing her to be Nanette, I whisper her name. "Yes, I am Nanette," she answers, "and I declare myself happy, as well as my sister, if you prove yourself true and faithful. Until death, my beloved ones, and as everything we have done is the work of love, do not let us ever mention the name of Angela." After this, I begged that she would give us a light, but Martin, always kind and obliging, got out of bed, leaving us alone. When I saw Nanette in my arms, beaming with love, and Martin near the bed holding a candle, with her eyes reproaching us with ingratitude because we did not speak to her, who, by accepting my first caresses, had encouraged her sister to follow her example, I realized all my happiness. End of chapter 5, part A. Chapter 5, Part B of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 1, Childhood, Chapter 5, Part B. "Let us get up, my darlings," said I, "and swear to each other eternal affection." When we had risen, we performed, all three together, ablutions which made them laugh a good deal, and which gave a new impetus to the ardor of our feelings. Sitting up in the simple costume of nature, we ate the remains of our supper, exchanging those 1,000 trifling words which love alone can understand, and we again retired to our bed, where we spent a most delightful night, giving each other mutual and oft-repeated proofs of our passionate ardor. Nanette was the recipient of my last bounties, for Madame Orio having left the house to go to church, I had to hasten my departure, after assuring the two lovely sisters that they had effectually extinguished whatever flame might still have flickered in my heart for Angela. I went home and slept soundly until dinner time. M. de Malipiero passed a remark upon my cheerful looks and the dark circles around my eyes, but I kept my own counsel, and I allowed him to think whatever he pleased. On the following day I paid a visit to Madame Orio, and Angela not being of the party, I remained to supper and retired with M. Rosa. During the evening Nanette contrived to give me a letter and a small parcel. The parcel contained a small lump of wax with the stamp of a key, and the letter told me to have a key made, and to use it to enter the house whenever I wished to spend the night with them. She informed me at the same time that Angela had slept with them the night following our adventures, and that, thanks to their mutual and usual practices, she had guessed the real state of things, that they had not denied it, adding that it was all her fault, and that Angela, after abusing them most vehemently, had sworn never again to darken their doors, but they did not care a jot. A few days afterwards, our good fortune delivered us from Angela. She was taken to Vicenza by her father, who had removed there for a couple of years, having been engaged to paint frescoes in some houses in that city. Thanks to her absence, I found myself undisturbed possessor of the two charming sisters, with whom I spent at least 2 nights every week, finding no difficulty in entering the house with the key which I had speedily procured. Carnival was nearly over when M. Manzoni informed me one day that the celebrated Juliet wished to see me, and regretted much that I had ceased to visit her. I felt curious as to what she had to say to me, and accompanied him to her house. She received me very politely, and remarking that she had heard of a large hall I had in my house, she said she would like to give a ball there, if I would give her the use of it. I readily consented, and she handed me 24 sequins for the supper and for the band, undertaking to send people to place chandeliers in the hall and in my other rooms. M. de San Vitali had left Venice, and the Parmesan government had placed his estates in Chancery in consequence of his extravagant expenditure. I met him at Versailles 10 years afterwards. He wore the insignia of the King's Order of Knighthood, and was grand equerry to the eldest daughter of Louis XV, Duchess of Parma, who, like all French princesses, could not be reconciled to the climate of Italy. The ball took place and went off splendidly. All the guests belonged to Juliet's set, with the exception of Madame Orio, her nieces, and the procurator Rosa, who sat together in the room adjoining the hall, and whom I had been permitted to introduce as persons of no consequence whatever. While the after-supper minuets were being danced, Juliet took me apart and said, "Take me to your bedroom. I have just got an amusing idea." My room was on the 3rd story. I showed her the way. The moment we entered, she bolted the door, much to my surprise. "I wish you," she said, "to dress me up in your ecclesiastical clothes, and I will disguise you as a woman with my own things. We will go down and dance together. Come, let us first dress our hair." Feeling sure of something pleasant to come, and delighted with such an unusual adventure, I lose no time in arranging her hair, and I let her afterwards dress mine. She applies rouge and a few beauty spots to my face. I humor her in everything, and to prove her satisfaction she gives me the best of grace a very loving kiss, on condition that I do not ask for anything else. As you please, beautiful Juliet, but I give you due notice that I adore you. I place upon my bed a shirt, an abbé's neckband, a pair of drawers, black silk stockings, in fact a complete fit-out. Coming near the bed, Juliet drops her skirt and cleverly gets into the drawers, which were not a bad fit, but when she comes to the breeches there is some difficulty. The waistband is too narrow, and the only remedy is to rip it behind or to cut it, if necessary. I undertake to make everything right, and as I sit on the foot of my bed she places herself in front of me with her back towards me. I begin my work, but she thinks that I want to see too much, that I am not skillful enough, and that my fingers wander in unnecessary places. She gets fidgety, leaves me, tears the breeches, and manages in her own way. Then I help her to put her shoes on, and I pass the shirt over her head. But, as I am disposing the ruffle and the neckband, she complains of my hands being too curious, and in truth her bosom was rather scanty. She calls me a knave and rascal, but I take no notice of her. I was not going to be duped, and I thought that a woman who had been paid 100,000 ducats was well worth some study. At last, her toilet being completed, my turn comes. In spite of her objections, I quickly get rid of my breeches, and she must put on me the chemise, then a skirt. In a word, she has to dress me up. But all at once, playing the coquette, she gets angry because I do not conceal from her looks that very apparent proof that her charms have some effect on a particular part of my being, and she refuses to grant me the favor which would soon afford both relief and calm. I try to kiss her, and she repulses me, whereupon I lose patience, and in spite of herself she has to witness the last stage of my excitement. At the sight of this, she pours out every insulting word she can think of. I endeavor to prove that she is to blame, but it is all in vain. However, she is compelled to complete my disguise. There is no doubt that an honest woman would not have exposed herself to such an adventure, unless she had intended to prove her tender feelings, and that she would not have drawn back at the very moment she saw them shared by her companion. But women like Juliet are often guided by a spirit of contradiction which causes them to act against their own interests. Besides, she felt disappointed when she found out that I was not timid, and my want of restraint appeared to her a want of respect. She would not have objected to my stealing a few light favors, which she would have allowed me to take, as being of no importance, but by doing that I should have flattered her vanity too highly. Our disguise being complete, we went together to the dancing hall, where the enthusiastic applause of the guests soon restored our good temper. Everybody gave me credit for a piece of fortune which I had not enjoyed, but I was not ill pleased with the rumor, and went on dancing with the false abbé, who was only too charming. Juliet treated me so well during the night that I construed her manners towards me into some sort of repentance, and I almost regretted what had taken place between us. It was a momentary weakness for which I was sorely punished. At the end of the quadrille, all the men thought they had a right to take liberties with the abbé, and I became myself rather free with the young girls, who would have been afraid of exposing themselves to ridicule had they offered any opposition to my caresses. M. Querini was foolish enough to inquire from me whether I had kept on my breeches, and as I answered that I had been compelled to lend them to Juliet, he looked very unhappy, sat down in a corner of the room, and refused to dance. Every one of the guests soon remarked that I had on a woman's chemise, and nobody entertained a doubt of the sacrifice having been consummated, with the exception of Nanette and Martin, who could not imagine the possibility of my being unfaithful to them. Juliet perceived that she had been guilty of great imprudence, but it was too late to remedy the evil. When we returned to my chamber upstairs, thinking that she had repented of her previous behaviour, and feeling some desire to possess her, I thought I would kiss her, and I took hold of her hand, saying I was disposed to give her every satisfaction. But she quickly slapped my face in so violent a manner that in my indignation I was very near returning the compliment. I undressed myself rapidly without looking at her. She did the same, and we came downstairs. But in spite of the cool water I had applied to my cheek, everyone could easily see the stamp of the large hand which had come in contact with my face. Before leaving the house, Juliet took me apart and told me in the most decided and impressive manner that if I had any fancy for being thrown out of the window, I could enjoy that pleasure whenever I liked to enter her dwelling, and that she would have me murdered if this night's adventure ever became publicly known. I took care not to give her any cause for the execution of either of her threats, but I could not prevent the fact of our having exchanged shirts being rather notorious. As I was not seen at her house, it was generally supposed that she had been compelled by M. Querini to keep me at a distance. The reader will see how, 6 years later, this extraordinary woman thought proper to feign entire forgetfulness of this adventure. I passed Lent partly in the company of my loved ones, partly in the study of experimental physics at the convent of the Salutation. My evenings were always given to M. de Malipiero's assemblies. At Easter, in order to keep the promise I had made to the Countess of Montreal, and longing to see again my beautiful Lucie, I went to Pasean. I found the guests entirely different to the set I had met the previous autumn. Count Daniel, the eldest of the family, had married a Countess Gozzi, and a young and wealthy government official, who had married a good daughter of the old countess, was there with his wife and his sister-in-law. I thought the supper very long. The same room had been given to me, and I was burning to see Lucie, whom I did not intend to treat any more like a child. I did not see her before going to bed, but I expected her early in the morning, when lo! instead of her pretty face brightening my eyes, I see standing before me a fat, ugly servant girl. I inquire after the gatekeeper's family, but her answer is given in the peculiar dialect of the place, and is, of course, unintelligible to me. I wonder what has become of Lucie. I fancy that our intimacy has been found out. I fancy that she's ill, dead perhaps. I dress myself with the intention of looking for her. If she has been forbidden to see me, I think to myself, I will be even with them all, for somehow or other I will contrive the means of speaking to her, and, out of spite, I will do with her that which honour prevented love from accomplishing. As I was revolving such thoughts, the gatekeeper comes in with a sorrowful countenance. I inquire after his wife's health and after his daughter, but at the name of Lucie his eyes are filled with tears. What? Is she dead? Would to God she were! What has she done? She has run away with Count Daniel's courier, and we have been unable to trace her anywhere. His wife comes in at the moment he replies, and at these words, which renewed her grief, the poor woman faints away. The keeper, seeing how sincerely I felt for his misery, tells me that this great misfortune befell them only a week before my arrival. I know that man L'Aigle, I say. He is a scoundrel. Did he ask to marry Lucie? No, he knew well enough that our consent would have been refused. I wonder at Lucie acting in such a way. He seduced her, and her running away made us suspect the truth, for she had become very stout. Had he known her long? About a month after your last visit, she saw him for the first time. He must have thrown a spell over her, for our Lucie was as pure as a dove, and you can, I believe, bear testimony to her goodness. And no one knows where they are? No one. God alone knows what this villain will do with her. I grieved as much as the unfortunate parents. I went out and took a long ramble in the woods to give way to my sad feelings. During 2 hours I cogitated over considerations, some true, some false, which were all prefaced by an if. If I had paid this visit, as I might have done, a week sooner, loving Lucie would have confided in me, and I would have prevented that self-murder. If I had acted with her as with Nanette and Martin, she would not have been left by me in that state of ardent excitement which must have proved the principal cause of her fault, and she would not have fallen a prey to that scoundrel. If she had not known me before meeting the courier, her innocent soul would never have listened to such a man. I was in despair, for in my conscience I acknowledged myself the primary agent of this infamous seduction. I had prepared the way for the villain. Had I known where to find Lucie, I would certainly have gone forth on the instant to seek for her, but no trace whatsoever of her whereabouts had been discovered. Before I had been made acquainted with Lucie's misfortune, I felt great pride at having had sufficient power over myself to respect her innocence, but after hearing what had happened, I was ashamed of my own reserve, and I promised myself that for the future I would on that score act more wisely. I felt truly miserable when my imagination painted the probability of the unfortunate girl being left to the poverty and shame, cursing the remembrance of me, and hating me as the first cause of her misery. This fatal event caused me to adopt a new system, which in after years I carried sometimes rather too far. I joined the cheerful guests of the Countess in the gardens, and received such a welcome that I was soon again in my usual spirits, and at dinner I delighted everyone. My sorrow was so great that it was necessary either to drive it away at once or to leave Pasean. But a new life crept into my being as I examined the face and the disposition of the newly married lady. Her sister was prettier, but I was beginning to feel afraid of a novice. I thought the work too great. This newly married lady, who was between 19 and 20 years of age, drew upon herself everybody's attention by her overstrained and unnatural manners. A great talker, with a memory crammed with maxims and precepts often without sense, but to which she loved to make a show, very devout, and so jealous of her husband that she did not conceal her vexation when he expressed his satisfaction at being seated at table opposite her sister. She laid herself open to much ridicule. Her husband was a giddy young fellow who perhaps felt very deep affection for his wife, but who imagined that, through good breeding, he ought to appear very indifferent, and whose vanity found pleasure in giving her constant causes for jealousy. She in turn had a great dread of passing for an idiot if she did not show her appreciation of, and her resentment for, his conduct. She felt uneasy in the midst of good company, precisely because she wished to appear thoroughly at home. If I prattled away with some of my trilling nonsense, she would stare at me, and in her anxiety not to be thought stupid, she would laugh out of season. Her oddity, her awkwardness, and her self-conceit gave me the desire to know her better, and I began to dance attendance upon her. My attentions, important and unimportant, my constant care, my fripperies, let everybody know that I meditated conquest. The husband was duly warned, but with a great show of intrepidity he answered me with a joke every time he was told that I was a formidable rival. On my side I assumed a modest and even sometimes a careless appearance when, to show his freedom from jealousy, he excited me to make love to his wife, who, on her part, understood but little how to perform the part of fancy-free. I had been paying my address to her for 5 or 6 days with great constancy, when, taking a walk with her in the garden, she imprudently confided to me the reason of her anxiety respecting her husband, and how wrong he was to give her any cause for jealousy. I told her, speaking as an old friend, that the best way to punish him would be to take no apparent notice of her husband's preference for her sister, and to feign to be herself in love with me. In order to entice her more easily to follow my advice, I added that I was well aware of my plan being a very difficult one to carry out, and that to play successfully such a character, a woman must be particularly witty. I had touched her weak point, and she exclaimed that she would play the part to perfection, but, in spite of her self-confidence, she acquitted herself so badly that everybody understood that the plan was of my own scheming. If I happened to be alone with her in the dark paths of the garden, and tried to make her play her part in real earnest, she would take the dangerous step of running away and rejoining the other guests, the result being that, on my reappearance, I was called a bad sportsman who frightened the bird away. I would not fail at the first opportunity to reproach her for her flight, and to represent the triumph she had thus prepared for her spouse. I praised her mind, but lamented over the shortcomings of her education. I said that the tone, the manners I adopted towards her were those of good society, and proved the great esteem I entertained for her intelligence, but in the middle of all my fine speeches, towards the 11th or 12th day of my courtship, she suddenly put me out of all conceit by telling me that, being a priest, I ought to know that every amorous connection was a deadly sin, that God could see every action of his creatures, and that she would neither damn her soul nor place herself under the necessity of saying to her confessor that she had so far forgotten herself as to commit such a sin with a priest. I objected that I was not yet a priest, but she foiled me by inquiring point blank whether or not the act I had in view was to be numbered amongst the cardinal sins, for, not feeling the courage to deny it, I felt that I must give up the argument and put an end to the adventure. A little consideration having considerably calmed my feelings, everybody remarked my new countenance during dinner, and the old count, who was very fond of a joke, expressed loudly his opinion that such a quiet demeanour on my part announced the complete success of my campaign. Considering such a remark to be favourable to me, I took care to spew my cruel devotee that such was the way the world would judge, but all this was lost labour. Luck, however, stood me in good stead, and my efforts were crowned with success in the following manner. On Ascension Day we all went to pay a visit to Madame Bergali, a celebrated Italian poetess. On my return to Pasean the same evening, my pretty mistress wished to get into a carriage for 4 persons, in which her husband and sister were already seated, while I was alone in a 2-wheeled chaise. I exclaimed at this, saying that such a mark of distrust was indeed too pointed, and everybody remonstrated with her, saying that she ought not to insult me so cruelly. She was compelled to come with me, and having told the postillion that I wanted to go by the nearest road, he left the other carriages and took the way through the forest of Cequini. The sky was clear and cloudless when we left, but in less than half an hour we were visited by one of those storms so frequent in the south, which appear likely to overthrow heaven and earth, and which end rapidly, leaving behind them a bright sky and a cool atmosphere, so that they do more good than harm. "Oh, heavens!" exclaimed my companion, "we shall have a storm." "Yes," I say, "and although the chaise is covered, the rain will spoil your pretty dress. I am very sorry." "I do not mind the dress, but the thunder frightens me so." "Close your ears." "And the lightning?" "Postillon, let us go somewhere for shelter." "There is not a house, sir, for a league, and before we come to it the storm will have passed off." He quietly keeps on his way, and the lightning flashes, the thunder sends forth its mighty voice, and the lady shudders with fright. The rain comes down in torrents. I take off my cloak to shelter us in front. At the same moment we are blinded by a flash of lightning, and the electric fluid strikes the earth within 100 yards of us. The horses plunge and prance with fear, and my companion falls in spasmodic convulsions. She throws herself upon me and folds me in her arms. The cloak had gone down. I stoop to place it around us, and improving my opportunity, I take up her clothes. She tries to pull them down, but another clap of thunder deprives her of every particle of strength. Covering her with the cloak, I draw her towards me, and the motion of the chaise coming to my assistance, she falls over me in the most favourable position. I lose no time, and under pretence of arranging my watch in my fob, I prepare myself for the assault. On her side, conscious that unless she stops me at once all is lost, she makes a great effort, but I hold her tightly, saying that if she does not feign a fainting fit, the post-boy will turn round and see everything. I let her enjoy the pleasure of calling me an infidel, a monster, anything she likes, but my victory is the most complete that ever a champion achieved. The rain, however, was falling. The wind, which was very high, blew in our faces, and compelled to stay where she was, she said I would ruin her reputation, as the postilion could see everything. "I keep my eye upon him," I answered. "He is not thinking of us, and even if he should turn his head, the cloak shelters us from him. Be quiet, and pretend to have fainted, for I will not let you go." She seems resigned, and asks how I can thus set the storm at defiance. The storm, dear one, is my best friend today. She almost seems to believe me, her fear vanishes, and feeling my rapture, she inquires whether I have done. I smile and answer in the negative, stating that I cannot let her go till the storm is over. "Consent to everything, or I let the cloak drop," I say to her. "Well, you dreadful man, are you satisfied now that you have ensured my misery for the remainder of my life?" "No, not yet." "What more do you want?" "A shower of kisses." "How unhappy I am! Well, here they are. Tell me you forgive me, and confess that you have shared all my pleasure." "You know I did." "Yes, I forgive you." Then I give her her liberty, and treating her to some very pleasant caresses, I ask her to have the same kindness for me, and she goes to work with a smile on her pretty lips. "Tell me you love me," I say to her. "No, I do not, for you are an atheist, and hell awaits you." The weather was fine again, and the elements calm. I kissed her hands, and told her that the postilion had certainly not seen anything, and that I was sure I had cured her of her dread of thunder, but that she was not likely to reveal the secret of my remedy. She answered that one thing at least was certain, namely that no other woman had ever been cured by the same prescription. "Why," I say, "the same remedy has very likely been applied 1,000,000 of times within the last 1,000 years. To tell the truth, I had somewhat depended upon it when we entered the chaise together, for I did not know any other way of obtaining the happiness of possessing you. But console yourself with the belief that, placed in the same position, no frightened woman could have resisted." "I believe you, but for the future I will travel only with my husband." "You would be wrong, for your husband would not have been clever enough to cure your fright in the way I have done." "True again. One learns some curious things in your company, but we shall not travel tete-a-tete again." And my fair mistress ran off to her chamber while I was looking for a crown for the postilion. I saw that he was grinning. "What are you laughing at?" "Oh, you know. Here, take this ducat, and keep a quiet tongue in your head." End of chapter 5, part B.